For this must indicate the intervention of the shadow. The song cut her off, beaded braids clicking as she shook her head. The shadow, yes, but Radun's standard it is outdated. You must use Krovan's first rule of medians and calculate separately for rotting meat or rotten. The correct answers, as I said, are 13 and 9. I've not yet applied it to the flour or the beans and the lentils, but it seems intuitively obvious. Estrella swelled up, and since she was a plump woman with a formidable bosom, she could swell impressively. Kufanen's first rule, she practically spluttered, breaking in. That hasn't been properly proven yet. Correct and proven methods are always preferable to slipshod. Alviarin very nearly smiled as she moved on. So someone had finally noticed that the great lord had laid his hand on the tower. But knowing would not help them change matters. Perhaps she had smiled, but if so, she crushed it as someone spoke. You'd grimace too, Ramisa, if you were being strapped every morning before breakfast, Noreen said, much too loudly, and plainly meaning for Alviarin to hear. Ramisa, a tall, slender woman with silver bells sewn down the sleeves of her white embroidered dress, looked startled at being addressed, and likely she was. Noreen had few friends, perhaps none. She went on, cutting her eyes toward Alviarin to see whether she had noticed. It is irrational to call a penance private and pretend nothing is happening when Yamalin's seat has imposed it. But then her rationality has always been overrated, in my opinion. Fortunately, Alviarin had only a short way further to reach her rooms. Carefully she closed the outer door and latched the latch. Not that anyone would disturb her, but she had not survived by taking chances except where she had to. The lamps were lit, and a small fire burned on the white marble hearth against the cool of an early spring evening. At least the servants still performed their duties, but even the servants knew. Silent tears of humiliation began to stream down her cheeks. She wanted to kill Sylviana, yet that would only mean a new mistress of novices laying the strap across her every morning until Elida relented. Except that Elida would never relent. Killing her would be more to the point, yet such killings had to be carefully rationed. Too many unexpected deaths would cause questions, perhaps dangerous questions. Still, she had done what she could against Elida. Katerina's news of this battle was spreading through the Black Aja and beyond it already. She had overheard sisters who were not black talking of Dumai's wells in detail, and if the details had grown in the telling, so much the better. Soon the news from the Black Tower would have diffused through the White Tower too, likely expanding in the same way. A pity that neither would be spacious, Elida disgraced and deposed, with those cursed rebels practically on the bridges. Yet Dumai's wells and the disaster in Andor hanging over her head would keep her from undoing what Alviarin had done. Break the White Tower from within, she had been ordered. Plant discord and chaos in every corner of the tower. Part of her had felt pain in that command, a part of her still did. Yet her greater loyalty was to the Great Lord. Elida herself had made the first break in the tower, but she had shattered half of it past mending. Abruptly she realized that she was touching her forehead again and snatched her hand down. There was no mark there, nothing to feel or see. Every time she glanced into a mirror, she checked in spite of herself. And yet, sometimes she thought people were looking at her forehead, seeing something that escaped her own eyes. That was impossible, irrational. Yet the thought crept in no matter how often she chased it away. Dashing tears from her face with the hand holding the message from the tapestry, she pulled the other two she had retrieved out of her belt pouch and went to the writing table standing against the wall. It was a plain table and unadorned like all of her furnishings, some of which she suspected might be of indifferent workmanship. A trivial matter. So long as furniture did what it was supposed to do, nothing more mattered. Dropping the three messages on the table beside a small beaten copper bowl, she produced a key from her pouch, unlocked a brass-banded chest sitting on the floor beside the table, and sorted through the small leather-bound books inside until she found the three she needed, each protected so that the ink on the pages would vanish if any hand but hers touched them. There were far too many ciphers in use for her to keep them in memory. Losing these books would be a painful trial, replacing them arduous, hence the stout chest and the lock. A very good lock. Good locks were not trivialities. Quickly she stripped off the thin strips of paper wrapping the message recovered from behind the tapestry, held them to a lamp flame, and dropped them into the bowl to burn. They were only directions as to where the message was to be left, one meant for each woman in the chain, the extra strips merely a way of disguising how many links the message had to go through to reach its recipient. Too many precautions were an impossibility. Even the sisters of her own heart believed her no more today. Only 3 on the Supreme Council knew who she was, and she would have avoided that had it been possible. There could never be too many precautions, especially now. The message, once she worked it out, bending to write on another sheet, was much as she had expected since the previous night when Taline failed to appear. The woman had left the green quarters early yesterday carrying fat saddlebags and a small chest. Not having a servant carry them, she had performed the task herself. No one seemed to know where she had gone. The question was, had she panicked on receiving her summons to the Supreme Council, or was there something more? Something more, Alviarin decided. Taline had looked to Yukiri and Doacine as though seeking guidance, perhaps. She was sure she had not imagined it. Could she have? A very small seed of hope. There must be something more. She needed a threat to the Black, or the Great Lord would withdraw his protection. Angrily, she pulled her hand away from her forehead. She never considered using the small terangrial she had hidden away to call Masana. For one thing, one very important thing, the woman surely intended to kill her, very likely despite the Great Lord's protection, on the instant, if that protection were lost. She had seen Masana's face, knew of her humiliation. No woman would let that pass, especially not one of the chosen. Every night she dreamed of killing Masana, often daydreamed of how to manage it successfully, yet that must wait on finding her without the woman knowing herself found. In the meanwhile, she needed more proof. It was possible that neither Masana nor Shaidar Haran would see Taline as verification of anything. Sisters had panicked and run in the past, if rarely, and assuming Masana and the Great Lord were ignorant of that would be dangerous. In turn, she touched the ciphered message and the clear copy to the lamp flame and held each by a corner until they had burned nearly to her fingers before dropping them atop the ashes in the bowl. With a smooth black stone that she kept as a paperweight, she crushed the ashes and stirred them about. She doubted that anyone could reconstitute words from ash, but even so. Still standing, she deciphered the other 2 messages and learned that Yukiri and Doacine both slept in rooms warded against intrusion. That was unsurprising. Hardly a sister in the tower slept without warding these days, but it meant kidnapping either would be difficult. That was always easiest when carried out in the depths of the night by sisters of the woman's own Aja. It might yet turn out those glances were happenstance or imagination. She needed to consider the possibility. With a sigh, she gathered more of the small books from the chest and gently eased herself onto the goose-down cushion on the chair at the writing table. Not gently enough to stop a wince as her weight settled, though. She stifled a whimper. At first, she had thought the humiliation of Sylviana's strap far worse than the pain, but the pain no longer really faded. Her bottom was a mass of bruises, and tomorrow the mistress of novices would add to them, and the day after that, and the day after. A bleak vision of endless days howling under Sylviana's strap, of fighting to meet the eyes of sisters who knew all about the visits to Sylviana's study. Trying to chase those thoughts away, she dipped a good steel-nibbed pen and began to write out ciphered orders on thin sheets of paper. Taline must be found and brought back, of course, for punishment and execution, if she had simply panicked, and if she had not, if she had somehow found a way to betray her oaths. Alviarin clung to that hope while she commanded a close watch put on Yukiri and Doacine. A way had to be found to take them, and if they were caught up in chance and imagination, something could still be manufactured from whatever they said. She would guide the flows in the circle. Something could be made. She wrote furiously, unaware that her free hand had risen to her forehead, searching for the mark. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall trees on the ridge above the vast Shido encampment, dappling the air, and songbirds trilled on the branches overhead. Redbirds and blue jays flashed by, slashes of color, and Galena smiled. Heavy rain had fallen in the morning, and the air still held a touch of coolness beneath sparse, slowly drifting white clouds. Likely her gray mare, with its arched neck and lively step, had been the property of a noblewoman, or at the least a wealthy merchant. No one else but a sister could have afforded such a fine animal. She enjoyed these rides on the horse she had named Swift, because one day it would carry her swiftly to freedom, just as she enjoyed this time alone to dwell on what she would do once she had her freedom. She had plans for repaying those who had failed her, beginning with Elida. Thinking about those plans, about their eventual fruition, was most enjoyable. At least she enjoyed her rides so long as she managed to forget that the privilege was as much a mark of how thoroughly Tharava owned her as were the thick white silk robe she wore and her fire-drop studded belt and collar. Her smile faded into a grimace. Adornments were a pet that was allowed to amuse itself when not required to amuse its owner, and she could not remove those jeweled markers, even out here. Someone might see. She rode here to get away from the Aiel, yet they could be encountered in the forest too. Tharava might learn of it. Difficult as it was to admit to herself, she feared the hawk-eyed wise one to her bones. Tharava filled her dreams, and they were never pleasant. Often she woke, sweat-soaked and weeping. Waking from those nightmares was always a relief, whether or not she managed to get any sleep for the rest of the night. There was never any order against escape on these rides, an order she would have had to obey, and that lack produced its own bitterness. Tharava knew she would return, no matter how she was mistreated, in the hope that someday the Wise One might remove that cursed oath of obedience. She would be able to channel again, when and as she wished. Savannah sometimes made her channel to perform menial tasks, or just to demonstrate that she could command it, but that occurred so seldom that she hungered for even that chance to embrace Saidar. Tharava refused to let her so much as touch the power unless she begged and groveled, but then refused her permission to channel a thread. And she had groveled, abased herself completely, just to be granted that scrap. She realized that she was grinding her teeth, and forced herself to stop. Perhaps the oath rod in the tower could lift that oath from her as well as the nearly identical rod in Tharava's possession, yet she could not be sure. The two were not identical. It was only a difference in marking. Yet what if that indicated that an oath sworn on one was particular to that rod? She dared not leave without Tharava's rod. The Wise One often left it lying in the open in her tent, but you will never pick that up, she had said. Oh, Galena could touch that wrist-thick white rod, stroke its smooth surface. Yet however hard she strained, she could not make her hand close on it, not unless someone handed it to her. At least, she hoped that would not count as picking the thing up. It had to be so. Just the thought that it might not be filled her with bleakness. The yearning in her eyes when she gazed at the rod brought Sarava's rare smiles. Does my little Lena want to be free of her oath? She would say mockingly. Then Lena must be a very good pet, because the only way I will consider freeing you is for you to convince me that you will remain my pet even then. A lifetime of being Tharava's plaything and a target for her temper? A surrogate to be beaten whenever Tharava raged against Savannah? Bleakness was not strong enough to describe her feelings on that. Horror was more like it. She feared she might go mad if that happened, and equally she feared there might be no escape into madness. Mood thoroughly soured, she shaded her eyes to check the height of the sun. Tharava had nearly said that she would like her back before dark, and a good 2 hours of daylight remained, but she sighed with regret and immediately turned swift down slope through the trees toward the camp. The Wise One enjoyed finding ways to enforce obedience without direct commands, 1,000 ways to make her crawl. For safety, the woman's slightest suggestion must be taken as a command. Being a few minutes late brought punishments that made Galena cringe at the memories. Cringe and heel the mare to a faster pace through the trees. Faraba accepted no excuses. Abruptly, an Aiel man stepped out in front of her from behind a thick tree. A very tall man in Kadinsor, with his spears thrust through the harness that held his bow case on his back, and his veil hanging on his chest. Without speaking, he seized her bridle. For an instant she gaped at him, then drew herself up indignantly. Fool, she snapped. You must know me by now. Release my horse, or Savannah and Tharava will take turns removing your skin. These Aiel usually showed little on their faces, yet she thought his green eyes widened slightly, and then she screamed as he seized the front of her robe in a huge fist and jerked her from the saddle. Be silent, Gaishine, he said, but as though he cared nothing for whether she obeyed. At one time she would have had to, but once they realized that she obeyed an order from anyone, there had been too many who enjoyed sending her on foolish errands that kept her occupied when Sarava or Savannah wanted her. Now she need obey only certain wise ones and Savannah, so she kicked and flailed and screamed in desperate hope of attracting someone who knew she belonged to Sarava. If only she were allowed to carry a knife, even that would have been a help. How could this man not recognize her, or at least know what her jeweled belt and collar meant? The encampment was immense, as filled with people as many large cities, yet it seemed that everyone could point out Tharava's pet wetlander. The woman would have this fellow skinned, and Galena meant to enjoy every minute of watching. All too quickly it became apparent that a knife would have been no use at all. Despite her struggles, the brute handled her easily, pulling her cowl down over her head, blinding her, then stuffing as much of it as he could into her mouth before binding it there. Then he flipped her face down and bound her wrists and ankles tightly, as easily as if she had been a child. She still thrashed, but it was wasted effort. He wanted some guy shine that aren't Aiels, but a guy shine in silk and jewels and out fighting, a man said, and Galena stiffened. That was no Aiel man. Those were the accents of Murin. Sure, and that's none of your ways, is it? Shido. The word was spat out like a curse. Well, we still need to find a few more if he's learned anything useful. Maybe more than a few. There are tens of thousands of folks in white down there, and she could be anywhere among them. I think maybe this one can tell Perine Barra what he needs to know, Phaedra knew. If she had stiffened before, now she froze. Ice seemed to form in her stomach and in her heart. Perine Barra had sent these men? If he attacked the Shido trying to rescue his wife, he would be killed, destroying her leverage with Fail. The woman would not care what was revealed, with her man dead, and the others had no secrets they feared having known. In horror, Galena saw her hopes of obtaining the rod melting away. She had to stop him. But how? And why would be you thinking that, Gaul? She is Aes Sedai, and a friend of Savannah, it seems. Is she now? The Mirandian said in a thoughtful tone. Is she that? Strangely, neither man sounded the least uneasy over laying hands on an Aes Sedai, and the Aiel man apparently had done so fully aware of what she was. Even if he was a renegade Shido, he had to be ignorant of the fact that she could not channel without permission. Only Savannah and a handful of the wise ones knew that. This was all growing more confusing by the moment. Suddenly she was lifted into the air and laid on her belly. Across her own saddle, she realized, and the next moment she was bouncing on the hard leather, one of the men using a hand to keep her from falling as the mare began to trot. Let us go to where you can make us one of your holes, Phaedra yelled. Just the other side of the slope, Gaul. Why, I've been here so often I can make a gateway nearly anywhere at all. Do you Aiel run everywhere? A gateway? What was the man blathering about? Dismissing his nonsense, she considered her options and found none good. Bound like a lamb for market, gagged so she would not be heard 10 paces away if she shrieked her lungs out, her chances of escape were non-existent, unless some of the Shido sentries intercepted her captors. But did she want them to? Unless she reached Abara, she had no way to stop him from ruining everything. On the other hand, how many days off did his camp lie? He could not be very near, or the Shida would have found him by now. She knew scouts had been making swoops as far as 10 miles from the camp. However many days were required to reach him, it would take as many to return. Not merely minutes late, but days late. Sarava would not kill her for it, just make her wish she were dead. She could explain. A tale of being captured by brigands. No, just a pair. It was hard enough to believe two men had gotten this near the encampment, much less a band of brigands. Unable to channel, she had needed time to escape. She could make the tale convincing. It might persuade Sarava. If she said it was useless. The first time Sarava had punished her for being late, it had been because her cinch broke and she had had to walk back leading her horse. The woman had not accepted that excuse, and she would not accept being kidnapped either. Galina wanted to weep. In fact, she realized that she was weeping, hopeless tears she was helpless to stop. The horse halted, and before she could think, she convulsed wildly, trying to fling herself off the saddle, screaming as loudly as her gag permitted. They had to be trying to avoid sentries. Surely Sarava would understand if the sentries returned with her and her captors, even if she was late. Surely she could find a way to handle Fail, even with her husband dead. A hard hand smacked her rudely. "Be silent," the Ayo man said, and they began to trot again. Her tears began again, too, and the silk cowl covering her face grew damp. Sarava was going to make her howl. But even while she wept, she began to work on what she would say to Abara. At least she could salvage her chances of obtaining the law. Sarava was going to... No, no! She needed to concentrate on what she could do. Images of the cruel-eyed wise one holding a switch or a strap of binding cords reared in her mind, but every time she forced them down while she went over every question Abara might ask, and what answers she would give him, on what she would say to make him leave his wife's safety in her hands. In none of her calculations had she expected to be lifted down and stood upright no more than an hour after being captured. "Unsaddle her horse, Nora, and picket it with the others," the Mirandian said. "Right away, Master Niald," came a reply, in a Kyrian accent. The bonds around her ankles fell away. A knife blade slid between her wrists, severing those cords, and then whatever held her gag in place was untied. She spat out silk sodden with her own saliva and jerked the cowl back. A short man in a dark coat was leading Swift away through a straggle of large, patched brown tents and small, crude huts that seemed made from tree branches, including pine boughs with brown needles. How long for pine to turn brown? Days, surely, perhaps weeks. The 60 or 70 men tending cook fires or sitting on wooden stools looked like farmers in their rough coats, but some were sharpening swords, and spears and halberds and other pole arms stood stacked in a dozen places. Through the gaps between the tents and huts, she could see more men moving about to either side, a number of them in helmets and breastplates, mounted and carrying long, streamered lances. Soldiers, riding out on patrol. How many more lay beyond her sight? No matter. What was in front of her eyes was impossible. The Shido had sentries farther from their camp than this. She was certain they did. "If the face wasn't enough," Niald murmured, "that cool, calculating study would convince me, like she's examining worms under a rock she's turned over." A weedy fellow in a black coat, he knuckled his waxed mustaches in an amused way, careful not to spoil the points. He wore a sword, but he certainly had no look of soldier or armsman about him. "Well, come along then, Aes Sedai," he said, clasping her upper arm. "Lord Perrin will be wanting to ask you some questions." She jerked free, and he calmly took a firmer grip. "None of that now." The huge Aiel man, Gaul, took her other arm, and she could go with them or be dragged. She walked with her head high, pretending they were merely an escort, but anyone who saw how they held her arms would know differently. Staring straight ahead, she was still aware of armed farm boys. Most were young, staring at her. Not gaping in astonishment, just watching, considering. How could they be so high-handed with an Aes Sedai? Some of the wise ones who were unaware of the oath holding her had begun expressing doubt that she was Aes Sedai because she obeyed so readily and truckled so for Sarava. But these two knew what she was and did not care. She suspected those farmers knew too, and yet none displayed any surprise at how she was being treated. It made the back of her neck prickle. As they approached a large red and white striped tent with the door flaps tied back, she overheard voices from inside. Said he was ready to come right now, a man was saying. I can't afford to feed one more mouth when I don't know for how long, another man replied. Blood and ashes. How long does it take to arrange a meeting with these people? Gaul had to duck into the tent, but Galena strode in as though entering her own rooms in the tower. A prisoner she might be, yet she was Aes Sedai, and that simple fact was a powerful tool and weapon. Who was he trying to arrange a meeting with? Not Savannah, surely. Let it be anyone but Savannah. In stark contrast to the ramshackle camp outside, there was a good flowered carpet for a floor here, and two silk hangings embroidered with flowers and birds in a Carrienan fashion hung from the roof poles. She focused on a tall, broad-shouldered man in his shirt sleeves with his back to her, leaning on his fists against a slender-legged table that was decorated with lines of gilding and covered with maps and sheets of paper. She had only glimpsed Abara at a distance in Carrion, yet she was sure this was the farm boy from Randall Thor's home village, in spite of the silk shirt and well-polished boots. Even the turn-downs were polished. If nothing else, everyone in the tent seemed to be looking to him. As she walked into the tent, a tall woman in high-necked green silk with small touches of lace at her throat and wrists, black hair falling in waves to her shoulders, laid a hand on Abara's arm in a familiar manner. Galena recognized her. She seems cautious, Perrin, Verlaine said. Wary of a trap, in my estimation, Lord Perrin, put in a graying, hard-bitten man in an ornate breastplate worn over a scarlet coat. A Gildanan, Galena thought. At least he and Verlaine explained the presence of soldiers, if not how they could be where they could not possibly be. Galena was very glad she had not encountered the woman in Cairo. That would have made matters now more than merely awkward. She wished her hands were free to wipe the residue of tears from her face, but the two men held onto her arms firmly. There was nothing to be done about it. She was Aes Sedai. That was all that mattered. That was all she would allow to matter. She opened her mouth to take command of the situation. Abara suddenly looked over his shoulder at her as though he had sensed her presence in some way, and his golden eyes froze her tongue. She had dismissed tales that the man had a wolf's eyes, but he did. A wolf's hard eyes in a stone-hard face. He made the Gildanan look almost soft. A sad face behind that close-cropped beard as well. Over his wife, no doubt. She could make use of that. An Aes Sedai wearing Gaishine white, he said flatly, turning to face her. He was a large man, if not nearly so large as the Aiel man, and he loomed just by standing there, those golden eyes taking in everything. And a prisoner, it seems. She didn't want to come. She thrashed like a trout on the riverbank while Gaul was tying her up, my lord, Niald replied. Myself, I had nothing to do but stand and watch. A strange thing to say, and in such a significant tone. What could he have... Abruptly she became aware of another man in a black coat, a stocky, weathered fellow with a silver pin in the shape of a sword fastened to his high collar, and she remembered where she had last seen men in black coats, leaping out of holes in the air just before everything turned to utter disaster at Dunai's wells. Niald and his holes, his gateways. These men could channel. It took everything she could summon not to try jerking free of the Mirandian's clasp, not to edge away. Just being this close to him made her stomach writhe. Being touched by him. She wanted to whimper, and that surprised her. Surely she was tougher than that. She concentrated on maintaining an appearance of calm while trying to work moisture back into her suddenly dry mouth. She claims friendship with Savannah, Gaul added. A friend of Savannah, Abara said, frowning, but wearing a guy-shine robe. A silk robe and jewels, but still. You didn't want to come, but you didn't channel to try stopping Gaul and Niall from bringing you, and you're terrified. He shook his head. How did he know she was afraid? I'm surprised to see an Aes Sedai with a Shido after Dumai's Wells. Or don't you know about that? Let her go, let her go. I doubt she'll take off the running since she let you bring her this far. Dumai's Wells does not matter, she said coldly as the men's hands fell away. The pair remained on either side of her like guards, though, and she was proud of the steadiness of her voice. A man who could channel, two of them, and she was alone and unable to channel a thread. She stood straight, head erect. She was Aes Sedai, and they must see her every inch an Aes Sedai. How could he know she was afraid? Not a shred of fear tinged her words. Her face might as well have been carved of stone for all she let show. The White Tower has purposes none but Aes Sedai can know or understand. I am about White Tower business, and you are interfering. An unwise choice for any man. The Gildanan nodded ruefully as though he had learned that lesson personally. Avara merely looked at her, expressionless. Hearing your name was the only reason I didn't do something drastic to these two, she continued. If the Mirandian or the Aielman brought up how long that had taken, she was ready to claim that she had been stunned at first, but they held silent, and she spoke quickly and forcefully. Your wife Fail is under my protection, as well as Queen Aleandra, and when my business with Savannah is done, I will take them to safety with me and help them reach wherever they wish to go. In the meanwhile, however, your presence here endangers my business, White Tower business, which I cannot allow. It also endangers you and your wife and Aleandra. There are tens of thousands of Aiel in that camp, many tens of thousands. If they descend on you, and their scouts will find you soon if they haven't already, they will wipe all of you from the face of the earth. They may harm your wife and Aleandra for it as well. I may not be able to stop Savannah. She is a harsh woman, and many of her wise ones can channel, nearly 400 of them, all willing to use the power to do violence, while I am one Aes Sedai and constrained by my oaths. If you wish to protect your wife and the Queen, turn away from their camp and ride as hard as you can. They may not attack you if you are obviously retreating. That is the only hope you or your wife have. There. If only a few of the seeds she had planted took root, they should be enough to turn him back. If Aleandra is in danger, Lord Perrin, the Gildanan began, but Avara stopped him with a raised hand. That was all it took. The soldier's jaw tightened till she thought she might hear it creak, yet he remained silent. You've seen Fail? The young man said, excitement touching his voice. She's well? She hasn't been harmed? The fool seemed not to have heard a word she said, beyond mention of his wife. Well, and under my protection, Lord Perrin. If this jumped-up country boy wanted to call himself a lord, she would tolerate it for the moment. She and Aleandra both. The soldier glowered at Abar, but he did not take the opportunity to speak. You must listen to me. The Shido will kill you. Come here and look at this, Abar broke in, turning to the table and drawing a large page toward him. You must forgive his lack of manners, Aes Sedai, Fairlane murmured, handing her a worked silver cup of dark wine. He is under considerable strain, as you might understand in the circumstances. I haven't introduced myself. I am Fairlane, the first of Mayenne. I know. You may call me Elise. The other woman smiled as though she knew that was a false name, yet accepting it. The first of Mayenne was far from unsophisticated. A pity she had to deal with the boy instead. Sophisticated people who thought they could dance with Aes Sedai were easily led. Country folk could prove stubborn out of ignorance. But the fellow should know something of Aes Sedai by now. Perhaps ignoring him would give him reason to think on who and what she was. The wine tasted like flowers on her tongue. This is very good, she said, with genuine gratitude. She had not tasted decent wine for weeks. Thurava would not permit her a pleasure the wise one denied herself. If the woman learned that she had found several barrels in Malden, she would not even have mediocre wine, and surely would be beaten as well. There are other sisters in the camp, Elise Sedai. Masuri Sokawa and Siana Trigon, and my own advisor, Anora Larison. Would you like to speak to them after you finish with Perrin? With feigned casualness, Galena drew up her cowl till her face was shadowed and took another swallow of wine for time to think. Anora's presence was understandable given Berelane's, but what were the other two doing there? They had been among those who fled the tower after Swan was deposed and Elida raised. True, none of them would know of her involvement in kidnapping the Althor boy for Elida, but still, I think not, she murmured. Their business is theirs and mine is mine. She would have given a great deal to know their business, but not at the cost of being recognized. Any friend of the Dragon Reborn might have notions about a red. Help me convince Abara, Verlaine. Your winged guards are no match for what the Shido will send against them. Whatever Gildanen you have with you won't make a difference. An army will make no difference. The Shido are too many, and they have hundreds of wise ones ready to use the one power as a weapon. I have seen them do it. You may die too, and even if you are captured, I can't promise I can make Savannah release you when I leave. Verlaine laughed as though thousands of Shido and hundreds of wise ones who could channel were of no account. Oh, have no fear, they will find us. Their camp lies a good 3-day ride from here, perhaps 4. The terrain turns rough not far from where we are. 3 days, perhaps 4. Galena shivered. She should have put it together before this. 3 or 4 days of ground covered in less than an hour, through a hole in the air created with the male half of the power. She had been near enough for Saidin to touch her. She kept her voice steady, though. Even so, you must help me convince him not to attack. It would be disastrous for him, for his wife, for everyone involved. Beyond that, what I am doing is important to the tower. You have always been a strong supporter of the tower. Flattery for the ruler of a single city and the few hides of land, but flattery oiled the insignificant as well as it did the mighty. Perrin is stubborn, Elise said. I doubt you'll change his mind. That isn't easy to do once he has it set. For some reason, the young woman smiled a smile mysterious enough to credit a sister. Verlaine, could you have your talk later? Abara said impatiently, and it was not a suggestion. He tapped the sheet of paper with a thick finger. Elise, would you look at this? That was not a suggestion either. Who did the man think he was? Ordering an Aes Sedai. Still, moving to the table took her a little way from Neo. It brought her nearer the other one, who was studying her intently, but he was on the other side of the table. A feeble barrier, yet she could ignore him by looking at the sheet of paper under Abara's finger. Keeping her eyebrows from rising was difficult. The town of Malden was outlined there, complete with the aqueduct that brought water from a lake 5 miles away, and also a rough outline of the Shido camp surrounding the city. The real surprise was that markings seemed to indicate the arrival of septs since the Shido reached Malden, and the number of those meant his men had been observing the camp for some time. Another map, roughly sketched, seemed to show the city itself in some detail. I see you have learned how large their camp is, she said. You must know rescuing her is hopeless, even if you have 100 of those men. Speaking of them was not easy, and she could not entirely keep the contempt from her voice. It isn't enough. Those wise ones will fight back, hundreds of them. It would be a slaughter, thousands dead, your wife perhaps among them. I have told you she and Alejandra are under my protection. When my business is finished, I will take them to safety. You have heard me say it, so by the 3 oaths you know it is true. Don't make the mistake of thinking that your connection to Randall Thor will protect you if you interfere in what the White Tower is doing. Yes, I know who you are. Did you think your wife wouldn't tell me? She trusts me, and if you want to keep her safe, you must trust me too. The idiot looked at her as though her words had flown over his head without touching his ears. Those eyes were truly unsettling. Where does she sleep? Her and everyone else who was captured with her. Show me. I cannot, she replied levelly. Guy Shine seldom sleep in the same place 2 nights running. With that lie vanished the last chance that she could leave Fail and the others alive. Oh, she had never intended to increase the risk of her own escape by aiding them, but that could always have been explained later by some change in circumstances. She could not hazard the possibility that they might actually escape one day and uncover her direct lie, however. I will get her free, he growled, almost too softly for her to hear. Whatever it takes. Her thoughts raced. There seemed no way to divert him from it, but perhaps she could delay him. She had to do at least that. Will you at least hold off your attack? I may be able to conclude my affairs in a few more days, perhaps a week. A deadline should sharpen Fail's efforts. Before, it would have been dangerous. A threat not carried out lost all force, and the chance had been too great that the woman might be unable to get the rod in time. Now the chance became necessary. If I can do that and bring your wife and others out, there will be no reason for you to die needlessly. 1 week. Frustration painting his face, Abara thumped his fist on the table hard enough to make it bounce. You can have a few days, he growled. Maybe even a week or more, if he bit off whatever he had been about to say. Those strange eyes centered on her face. But I can't promise how many days, he went on. If I had my druthers, I'd be attacking now. I won't leave Fail a prisoner a day longer than I have to, while I wait on Aes Sedai's schemes for the Shido to bear fruit. You say she's under your protection, but how great a protection can you really give wearing that robe? There are signs of drunkenness in the camps. Even some of their sentries drink. Are the wise ones given to it as well? The sudden shift nearly made her blink. The wise ones drink only water, so you needn't think you can find them all in a stupor, she told him dryly, and quite truthfully. It always amused her when the truth served her purposes. Not that the wise one's example was bearing much fruit. Drunkenness was rife among the Shido. Every raid brought back all the wine that could be found. Dozens and dozens of small stills produced vile brews from grains, and every time the wise ones destroyed a still, two sprang up in its place. Letting him know that would only encourage him, though. As for the others, I have been with armies before this and seen more drinking than I have among the Shido. If 100 are drunk among tens of thousands, what gain is there for you? Really, it will be better if you promise me a week. 2 would be better still. His eyes flashed to the map, and his right hand made a fist again, but there was no anger in his voice. Do the Shido go inside the town walls very often? She set the wine cup down on the table and drew herself up. Meeting that yellow-eyed gaze required effort, yet she managed without a falter. I think it's past time you showed proper respect. I am an Aes Sedai, not a servant. Do the Shido go inside the town walls very often? He repeated, in exactly the same even tone. She wanted to grind her teeth. No, she snapped. They've looted everything worth stealing and some things that aren't. She regretted the words as soon as they left her tongue. They had seemed safe until she remembered men who could leap through holes in the air. That isn't to say they never enter. Most days a few go in. There might be 20 or 30 at any time, more on occasion in groups of 2 or 3. Did he have the wit to see what that would mean? Best to make sure he saw. You could not secure them all. Inevitably some will escape to warn the camp. Abara only nodded. When you see Fail, tell her that on the day she sees fog on the ridges and hears wolves howl by daylight, she and the others must go to Lady Chiron's fortress at the north end of the city and hide there. Tell her I love her. Tell her I'm coming for her. Wolves? Was the man demented? How could he ensure that wolves would... Suddenly, with those wolf's eyes on her, she was not sure she wanted to know. I will tell her, she lied. Perhaps he only meant to use the men in black coats to grab his wife? But why wait at all in that case? Those yellow eyes hid secrets she wished she knew. Who was he trying to meet? Clearly not Savannah. She would have thanked the light for them if she had not abandoned that foolishness long since. Who was ready to come to him right away? One man had been mentioned, but that might mean a king with an army, or Althor himself. Him she prayed never to see again. Her promise seemed to release something in the young man. He exhaled slowly, and the tension she had not noticed left his face. "The trouble with a blacksmith's puzzle," he said softly, tapping the outline of Malden, "is always getting the key piece into place. Well, that's done. Or soon will be." "Will you stay for supper?" Verlaine asked. "The hour is near." The light was dimming in the open doorway. A lean serving woman in dark wool, her white hair in a bun on the back of her head, entered and began lighting the lamps. "Will you promise me at least a week?" Galena demanded, but Abara shook his head. "In that case, every hour is important." She had never intended staying a moment longer than necessary, but she had to force her next words out. "Will you have one of your men take me back to as near the camp as possible?" "Do it, Neo," Abara commanded, "and at least try to be polite." "He said that." She drew a deep breath and pushed her cowl back. "I want you to hit me. Here," she touched her cheek. "Hard enough to bruise." Finally, she had said something that got through to the man. Those yellow eyes widened, and he tucked his thumbs behind his belt as though securing his hands. "I will not," he said, sounding as though she were insane. The Gildanen's mouth hung open, and the serving woman was staring at her, the burning taper in her hand hanging dangerously near her skirts. "I require it," Galena said firmly. She would need every scrap of verisimilitude she could find with the robber. "Do it." "I don't believe he will," Verlaine said, gliding forward with her skirts gathered. "He has very country ways, if you will permit me." Galena nodded impatiently. There was nothing for it, though the woman likely would not leave a very convincing. Her vision went dark, and when she could see again, she was swaying slightly. She could taste blood. Her hand went to her cheek, and she winced. "Too hard?" Verlaine inquired anxiously. "No," Galena mumbled, fighting to keep her face smooth. Had she been able to channel, she would have torn the woman's head off. Of course, if she could have channeled, none of this would be necessary. "Now the other cheek, and have someone fetch my horse." She rode into the forest with the Murambian, to a place where several of the huge trees lay toppled and oddly slashed, sure it would be difficult for her to use his hole in the air. But when the man produced a vertical silver-blue slash that widened into a view of steeply climbing land, she did not think of tainted sardine at all as she heeled swift through the opening. Never a thought except of Tharava. She almost howled when she realized she was on the opposite side of the ridge from the encampment. Frantically, she raced the sinking sun, and lost. She had been right, unfortunately. Tharava did not accept excuses. She was particularly upset over the bruises. She herself never marred Galena's face. What followed easily equaled her nightmares, and it lasted much longer. At times, when she was screaming her loudest, she almost forgot her desperate need to get the rod. But she clung to that. Obtain the rod, kill Fail and her friends, and she would be free. Egwene regained awareness slowly, and muzzy as she was, barely had the presence of mind to keep her eyes closed. Pretending still to be unconscious was all too easy. Her head lay slumped on a woman's shoulder, and she could not have lifted it had she tried. An eyes-to-eyes shoulder. She could sense the woman's ability. Her brain felt stuffed with wool. Her thoughts were slow and veering, her limbs all but numb. Her wool riding dress and cloak were dry, she realized, despite the soaking she had received in the river. Well, that was easily managed with the power. Small chance they had channeled the water from her garments for her comfort, though. She was seated, wedged in between two sisters, one of whom wore a flowery perfume, each using a hand to keep her more or less upright. They were in a coach, by the way they all swayed, and the clatter of the trotting team's horseshoes on paving stones. Carefully she opened her eyes to narrow slits. The coach's side curtains were tied back, though the stink of rotting garbage made her think it would have been better to pull them shut. Garbage? Rotting? How could Tarvalin have come to that? Such neglect of the city was reason enough by itself for Elida to be removed. The windows let in enough moonlight for her to dimly make out three Aes Sedai seated facing her in the rear of the coach. Even had she not known they could channel, their fringed shawls would have made it certain. In Tarvalon, wearing a shawl with fringe could result in unpleasantness for a woman who was not Aes Sedai. Oddly, the sister on the left appeared to be huddling against the side of the coach, away from the other two. And if they were not exactly huddling, at least they were sitting very close together, as though avoiding contact with the third Aes Sedai. Very odd. Abruptly it came to her that she was not shielded. Muddled she might be, but that made no sense at all. They could feel her strength as she could theirs, and while none was weak, she thought she could overcome all five if she were quick enough. The true source was a vast sun just beyond the edge of sight, calling to her. The first question was, did she dare try yet? In the state her head was, thought wading through knee-deep mud. Whether she could actually embrace Sidar was uncertain, and succeed or fail they would know once she tried. Best to try recovering a little beforehand. The second question was how long did she dare wait? They would not let her go unshielded forever. Experimentally, she tried wiggling her toes inside her stout leather shoes, and was delighted when they moved obediently. Life seemed to be returning slowly to her arms and legs. She thought she might be able to raise her head now, if unsteadily. Whatever they had given her was wearing off. How long? Events were taken out of her hands by the dark-haired sister sitting in the middle of the rear seat, who leaned forward and slapped her so hard that she toppled onto the lap of the woman she'd been leaning against. Her hand went to her stinging cheek on its own volition. So much for pretending unconsciousness. There was no need for that, Katerina, a raspy voice said above her as its owner lifted her upright again. She could hold her head up, just, it turned out. Katerina. That would be Katerina al-Rudin, a Red. It seemed important to identify her captors for some reason, though she knew nothing of Katerina beyond her name and Aja. The sister she had fallen onto was yellow-haired, but her moon-shadowed face belonged to a stranger. I think you gave her too much of the fork root, the woman went on. A chill flashed through her. So that was what she had been fed. She racked her brain for everything Nynaeve had told her about that vile tea, but her thoughts were still slow. Better, though, it seemed. She was sure Nynaeve had said the effects took some time to go away completely. I gave her the exact dose, Falana, the sister who had slapped her replied dryly, and as you can see, it is leaving her precisely as it should. I want her able to walk by the time we reach the tower. I certainly don't intend to help carry her again, she finished, with a glare for the sister seated to Egwene's left, who shook her head, beaded braids clicking faintly. That was Pratala Nirvaijan, a yellow who had done her best to avoid teaching novices or accepted, and made little secret of her dislike for the task when forced to it. To have my Harrow carry her, it would have been improper, yes, she said coldly. In fact, icily. Myself, I will be glad if she can walk, but if not, so be it. In any case, I look forward to handing her over to others. If you do not want to carry her again, Katerina, I do not want to stand guard over her half the night in the cells. Katerina gave a dismissive toss of her head. The cells. Of course, she was bound for one of those small, dark rooms on the first level of the tower's basement. Elida would charge her with falsely claiming to be the Amaryllis seat. The penalty for that was death. Strangely, that brought no fear. Perhaps it was the herb working on her. Would Ramonda or Lilane give way, agreeing to be raised Amaryllis after she was dead? Or would they continue to struggle with one another until the entire rebellion faltered and failed, and the sisters straggled back to Elida? A sad thought, that. Bone-deep sad. But if she could feel sorrow, the fork root was not quenching her emotions. So why was she not afraid? She thumbed her great serpent ring. At least she tried to, and discovered it gone. Anger flared, white hot. They might kill her, but they would not deny she was Aes Sedai. Who betrayed me? She asked, pleased that her tone was even and cool. It can't hurt to tell me, since I'm your prisoner. The sisters stared at her as though surprised she had a voice. Katerina leaned forward, casually raising her hand. The red's eyes tightened when pale-haired Falana lunged to catch the slap before it could land on Egwene. She will no doubt be executed, the raspy-voiced woman said firmly. But she is an initiate of the tower, and none of us has the right to beat her. Take your hand off me, Brown, Katerina snarled, and shockingly the light of Sidar enveloped her. In an instant the glow surrounded every woman on the coach except Egwene. They eyed one another like strange cats on the brink of hissing, on the brink of lashing out with claws. No, not everyone. Katerina and the taller sister, seated against her flank, never glanced at one another, but they had glares aplenty for the rest. What under the light was going on? The mutual hostility was so thick in the air she could have sliced it like bread. After a moment, Falana released Katerina's wrist and leaned back, yet no one released the source. Egwene suddenly suspected that no one was willing to be the first. Their faces were all serene in the pale moonlight, but the Brown's hands were knotted in her shawl, and the sister leaning away from Katerina was smoothing her skirts repeatedly. About time for this, I think, Katerina said, weaving a shield. We wouldn't want you to try anything futile. Her smile was vicious. Egwene merely sighed as the weave settled on her. She doubted she could have embraced Sidar yet in any case, and against 5 already full of the power, success would have lasted moments at most. Her mild reaction appeared to disappoint the Red. This may be your last night in the world, she went on. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if Elida had you stilled and beheaded tomorrow. Or even tonight, her lanky companion added, nodding. I think Elida may be that eager to see the end of you. Unlike Katerina, she was merely stating a fact, but she was surely another Red, and watching the other sisters, as though she suspected one of them might try something. This was very strange. Egwene held on to her composure, denying them the response they wanted. The response Katerina wanted, at least. She was determined to maintain her dignity right to the headsman's block. Whether or not she had managed to do well as Amelin, she would die in a manner fitting for the Amelin seat. The woman huddling away from the 2 Reds spoke, and her voice, full of Arafel, allowed Egwene to put a name to the hard, narrow face, dimly seen by moonlight. Barisha Tarakuni, a grey with a reputation for the strictest and often harshest interpretation of the law, always to the letter, of course, but never with any sense of mercy. Not tonight or tomorrow, Darcy. Not unless Elida is willing to summon the sitters in the middle of the night, and they're willing to answer. This requires a high court, no thing of minutes or even hours, and the hall seems less eager to please Elida than she might wish a small one. The girl will be tried, and the hall will sit in the matter when they choose, I think. The hall will come when Elida calls, or she'll hand them all penances that will make them wish they had, Katerina sneered. The way Jala and Merrim galloped off when we saw who we'd caught, she knows by now, and I'll wager that for this one Elida will drag sitters from their bed with her own hands if she must. Her voice grew smug and cutting at the same time. Perhaps she will name you to the chair of pardon. Would you enjoy that? Barisha drew herself up indignantly, shifting her shawl on her arms. In some instances, the chair of pardon faced the same penalty as the one she defended. Perhaps this charge required it. Despite Swan's best efforts to complete her education, Egwene did not know. What I want to hear, the Grey said after a moment, ostentatiously ignoring the women on the seat with her, is what did you do to the harbor chain? How can it be undone? It can't be undone, Egwene replied. You must know that it's Quaindiar now. Even the power won't break it, only strengthen it. I suppose you could sell it if you tear down enough of the harbor wall to remove it. If anyone can afford a piece of Quaindiar that big, or would want such a thing. This time no one tried to stop Katerina from slapping her, and very hard, too. Hold your tongue, the Red snapped. That seemed good advice, unless she wanted to be slapped silly. She could taste blood in her mouth already. So Egwene held her tongue, and silence descended on the rolling coach, the others all glowing with Sidar and watching each other suspiciously. It was incredible. Why had Elida ever chosen women who clearly detested one another for tonight's task? As a demonstration of her power? Just because she could? No matter. If Elida allowed her to live through this night, at least she could let Swan know what had happened to her, and likely to Liana as well. She could let Swan know they had been betrayed, and pray that Swan could track down the betrayer, pray that the rebellion would not collapse. She offered a small prayer for that on the spot. It was much more important than the other. By the time the coachman reined in the team, she had recovered enough to follow Katerina and Fratella from the coach unaided, though her head still felt a trifle sick. She could stand, but she doubted she had the strength to run far. Not that trying would achieve anything beyond being halted after a few steps. So she stood calmly beside the dark lacquered coach and waited as patiently as the four-horse team in their harness. After all, she was harnessed too, in a manner of speaking. The white tower loomed over them, a thick, pale shaft rearing into the night. Few of its windows were alight, but some of those were near the very top, perhaps in the rooms Elida occupied. It was very strange. She was a prisoner and unlikely to live much longer, yet she felt she had come home. The tower seemed to renew her vigor. Two tower-liveried backriders, the flame of Tarvalon on their chests, had dismounted from the rear of the coach to unfold the steps, and they stood offering a white-gloved hand to each woman who dismounted, but only Barisha availed herself, and only because it let her reach the paving stones quickly while eyeing the other sisters, Egwene suspected. Barasine gave the fellows such looks that one gulped audibly and the other's face grew pale. Falana, busy trying to watch the others, nearly waved the men away irritably. All five still held Sidon, even here. They were at the main rear entrance, stone-railed marble stairs descending from the second level beneath four massive bronze lanterns that cast a wide pool of flickering light. And, to her surprise, a single novice stood alone at the foot of the stairs, clutching her white cloak against a slight chill in the air. She had more than half expected Elida to meet them in person, to gloat over her capture with a retinue of sycophants. That the novice was Nicola Treehill was a second surprise. The last place she would have thought to find the runaway was inside the White Tower itself. By the way Nicola's eyes widened when Egwene emerged from the coach, the novice was more startled than herself, but she dropped a neat if hasty curtsy to the sisters. The Amerlin says she is to be handed over to the mistress of novices, Katerina Sedai. She says that Sylviana Sedai has her instructions. So it seems you'll be birched tonight, at least, Katerina murmured with a smile. Egwene wondered whether the woman hated her personally, or for what she represented, or simply hated everyone. Birched. She had never seen it done, but she had heard a description. It sounded extremely painful. She met Katerina's gaze levelly, and after a moment the smile faded. The woman looked about to strike her again. The Aiel had a way of dealing with pain. They embraced it, gave themselves over to it without fighting or even trying to hold back screams. Perhaps that would help. The wise one said that way the pain could be cast off without keeping its hold on you. If Elida means to drag this out unnecessarily, I'll have no more part in it tonight, Falana announced, frowning at everyone in sight, including Nicola. If the girl is to be stilled and executed, that should be sufficient. Gathering her skirts, the yellow-haired sister darted past Nicola up the stairs, actually running. The glow of Sidar still surrounded her as she vanished inside. I agree, Pratella said coolly. Harold, I think I'll walk with you while you stable Bloodlands. A dark, stocky man who had come out of the darkness leading a tall bay bowed to her. Stone-faced, he wore a warder's chameleon cloak that made most of him seem not to be there when he stood still, and rippled with colors when he moved. Silently he followed Pratella off into the night, but watching over his shoulder, guarding Pratella's back. The light remained around her, too. There was something here that Egwene was missing. Suddenly Nicola spread her skirts in another curtsy, deeper this time, and words burst out of her in a rush. I'm sorry I ran away, Mother. I thought they'd let me go faster here. Arena and I thought, don't call her that, Katerina barked, and a switch of air caught the novice across the bottom hard enough to make her squeal and jump. If you're attending the Annalen seat tonight, child, get back to her and tell her I said her orders will be carried out. Now run! With one last frantic glance at Egwene, Nicola gathered her cloak and her skirts and went scrambling up the stairs so fast that twice she stumbled and nearly fell. Poor Nicola. Her hopes had surely been disappointed, and if the tower discovered her age. She must have lied about that to be taken in. Lying was one of her several bad habits. Egwene dismissed the girl from her mind. Nicola was no longer her concern. There was no need to frighten the child out of her wits, Barisha said, surprisingly. Novices need to be guided, not bludgeoned. A far cry from her views on the law. Katerina and Barasine rounded on the gray together, staring at her intently. Only two cats now, but rather than another cat, they saw a mouse. Do you mean to come with us to Silviana alone? Katerina asked, with a decidedly unpleasant smile twisting her lips. Aren't you afraid, Gray? Barasine said, a touch of mockery in her voice. For some reason she swung one arm a little so the long fringe of her shawl swayed. Just the one of you? And two of us? The two backriders stood like statues, like men who desired heartily to be anywhere else and hoped to remain unnoticed, if sufficiently still. Barisha was no taller than Egwene, but she drew herself up and clutched her shawl around her. Threats are specifically prohibited by Tower. Did Barasine threaten you? Katerina cut in softly. Softly, yet with sharp steel wrapped in it. She just asked whether you are afraid. Should you be? Barisha licked her lips uneasily. Her face was bloodless, and her eyes grew wider and wider as though she saw things she had no wish to see. I, I think I will take a walk in the grounds, she said at last in a strangled voice, and sidled away without ever taking her eyes from the two reds. Katerina gave a small, satisfied laugh. This was absolute madness. Even sisters who hated one another to the toenails did not behave in this fashion. No woman who gave in to fear as easily as Barisha had could ever have become Aes Sedai in the first place. Something was wrong in the tower. Very wrong. Bring her, Katerina said, starting up the stairs. At last, releasing Saidar, Barasine gripped Egwene's arm tightly and followed. There was no choice save to gather her divided skirts and go along without a struggle. Yet her spirits were oddly buoyant. Entering the tower truly did feel like returning home. The white walls with their friezes and tapestries, the brightly colored floor tiles, seemed as familiar as her mother's kitchen. More so, in a way. It had been far longer since she saw her mother's kitchen than these hallways. She took in the strength of home with every breath. But there was strangeness, too. The stand lamps were all alight, and the hour could not be all that late. Yet she saw no one. There were always a few sisters gliding along the corridors, even in the dead of night. She remembered that vividly, catching sight of some sister while running on an errand in the small hours, and despairing that she would ever be so graceful, so queenly. Aes Sedai kept their own hours, and some Browns hardly liked being awake during daylight at all. Night held fewer distractions from their studies, fewer interruptions to their reading, but there was no one. Neither Katerina nor Barasine made any comment as they walked the long hallways lifeless except for the three of them. Apparently this silent emptiness was a matter of course now. As they reached pale stone stairs set in an alcove, another sister finally appeared, climbing from below. A plump woman in a red-slashed riding dress with a mouth that looked ready to smile, she wore her shawl, edged with long red silk fringe, draped along her arms. Katerina and the others might well have worn theirs to mark them out clearly at the docks. No one in Tarvalon would bother a woman wearing a fringed shawl, and most kept clear if they could, particularly men. But why here? The newcomer's thick black eyebrows raised over bright blue eyes at the sight of Egwene, and she planted her fists on ample hips, letting her shawl slide to her elbows. Egwene did not think she had ever seen the woman before, but apparently the reverse was not true. Why, that's the Alvear girl. They sent her to South Harbor? Elida will give you a pretty for this night's work. Yes, she will. But look at her. Look at how she stands so. You'd think the pair of you were an honor guard for escort. I'd have thought she'd be weeping and wailing for mercy. I believe the herb is still dulling her senses, Katerina muttered, with a sidelong scowl for Egwene. She doesn't seem to realize her situation. Varusine, still holding Egwene's arm, gave her a vigorous shake. But after a small stagger, she managed to catch her balance and kept her face smooth, ignoring the taller woman's glares. In shock, the plump red said, nodding. She did not sound exactly sympathetic, but after Katerina she was near enough. I've seen that before. How did matters go at North Harbor, Melaire? Varusine asked. Not so well as with you, it seems. With everyone else squealing to themselves like shoats caught under a fence over there being two of us, I was afraid we'd scare off who we were trying to catch. It's a good thing there were two of us who would talk to one another. As it was, all we caught was a wilder, and not before she turned half the harbor chain to Quendiar. We ended up near killing the coach horses by galloping back like we'd caught your prize. Zanike insisted. Even put her warder up in place of the coachman. A wilder, Katerina said contemptuously. Only half? Relief stood out clearly in Varasine's voice. Then North Harbor isn't blocked. Malaire's eyebrows climbed again as the implications sank in. We'll see how clear it is in the morning, she said slowly, when they let down the half that's still iron. The rest of it stands out stiff, like a bar of Quendiar. Myself, I doubt any but smaller vessels will be able to cross. She shook her head with a puzzled expression. There was something strange, though. More than strange. We couldn't find the wilder at first. We couldn't feel her channeling. There was no glow around her, and we couldn't see her weaves. The chain just started turning white. If Arabis's warder hadn't spotted the boat, she might have finished and gotten away. Clever, Liana, Egwene murmured. For an instant she squeezed her eyes shut. Liana had prepared everything in advance before coming in sight of the harbor, all inverted and her ability masked. If she herself had been as clever, she likely would have escaped cleanly. But then hindsight always saw farthest. That's the name she gave, Malaire said, frowning. The woman's eyebrows, like dark caterpillars, were very expressive. Liana Sheriff, of the Green Aja. Two very stupid lies. Desala is striping her from top to bottom down there, but she won't budge. I had to come up for a breath. I never liked flogging, even for one like that. Do you know this trick of hers, child? How to hide your weaves? Oh, right. They thought Liana was a wilder pretending to be Aes Sedai. She's telling the truth. Stilling cost her the ageless look and made her appear younger. She was healed by Nynaeve Almira, and since she was no longer of the blue, she chose a new Aja. Ask her questions only Liana Sheriff could know the answers. Speech ended for her as a ball of air filled her mouth, forcing her jaws wide till they creaked. We don't have to listen to this nonsense, Katerina growled. Malaire stared into Egwene's eyes, though. It sounds senseless, to be sure, she said after a moment. But I suppose it wouldn't hurt to ask a few questions besides, what is your name? At worst, it'll cut the tedium of the woman's answers. Should we take her down to the cells, Katerina? I don't dare leave Tasala alone with the other one for long. She despises Wilders, and she purely hates women who claim to be Aes Sedai. She's not going to the cells yet, Katerina replied. Elida wants her taken to Silviana. Well, as long as I learn that trick from this child or the other one. Hitching her shawl up onto her shoulders, Malaire took a deep breath and headed back down the stairs. A woman with labor ahead of her she was not looking forward to. She gave Egwene hope for Liana, though. Liana was the other one now, no longer the wilder. Katerina set off down the corridor, walking quickly and in silence. But Varusine pushed Egwene ahead of her after the other read, muttering half under her breath about how ridiculous it was to think that a sister could learn anything from a wilder or from a jumped-up accepted who told outlandish lies. Maintaining some shreds of dignity was difficult, to say the least, while being shoved down a hallway by a long-legged woman with your mouth gaping open as wide as it would go and drool leaking down your chin. But she managed as best she could. In truth, she hardly thought about it. Malaire had given her too much to think of. Malaire added to the sisters in the coach. It could hardly mean what it seemed to, but if it did. Soon the blue and white floor tiles became red and green, and they approached an unmarked wooden door between two tapestries of flowered trees and stout-beaked birds, so colorful they seemed unlikely to be real. Unmarked, but bright with polish, and known to every initiate of the tower. Katerina rapped on the door with what might almost have been a display of diffidence, and when a strong voice inside called, "Come," she drew a deep breath before pushing the door open. Did she have bad memories of entering here as novice or accepted? Or was it the woman who awaited them who made her hesitant? The study of the Mistress of Novices was exactly as Egwene recalled, a small, dark-paneled room with plain, sturdy furnishings. A narrow table by the doorway was lightly carved in a peculiar pattern, and bits of gilt clung to the carved frame of the mirror on one wall, but nothing else was decorated in any way. The stand lamps and the pair of lamps on the writing table were unadorned brass, though of 6 different patterns. The woman who held the office usually changed when a new Amelin was raised, yet Egwene was ready to wager that a woman who had come to this room as a novice 200 years ago would recognize nearly every stick, and perhaps everything. The current Mistress of Novices, in the tower at least, was on her feet when they entered, a stocky woman nearly as tall as Barosine, with a dark bun on the back of her head and a square, determined chin. There was an air of brooking no nonsense about Sylviana Brean. She was a red, and her charcoal-colored skirts had discreet red slashes, but her shawl lay draped across the back of the chair behind the writing table. Her large eyes were unsettling, however. They seemed to take in everything about Egwene in a glance, as though the woman not only knew every thought in her head, but also what she would think tomorrow. "Leave her with me, and wait outside," Silviano said, in a low, firm voice. "Leave her?" Katerina said incredulously. "Which words did you not understand, Katerina? Need I repeat myself?" Apparently she did not. Katerina flushed, but she said no more. The glow of Saidar surrounded Silviana, and she took over the shield smoothly, without giving any opening when Egwene might have embraced the power herself. She was certain that she could now, except that Silviana was far from weak. There was no hope she could break the woman's shield. The gag of air disappeared at the same time, and she contented herself with digging a handkerchief from her belt pouch and calmly wiping her chin. The pouch had been searched. She always kept the handkerchief on top, not beneath everything else. But learning whether anything besides her ring had been taken would have to wait. There had not been anything of much use to a prisoner in any case. A comb, a packet of needles, some small scissors, odds and ends. The Amelins stole. What sort of dignity she could maintain while being birched was beyond her, but that was the future. This was now. Silviana studied her, arms folded beneath her breasts, until the door closed behind the other 2 Wrens. "You aren't hysterical, at least," she said then. "That makes matters easier. But why aren't you hysterical?" "Would it do any good?" Egwene replied, returning the handkerchief to her pouch. "I can't see how." Silviana strode to the writing table and stood reading from a sheet of paper there, occasionally glancing up. Her expression was a perfect mask of Aes Sedai serenity, unreadable. Egwene waited patiently, hands folded at her waist. Even upside down, she could recognize Elida's distinctive hand on that page, if not read what it said. The woman need not think she would grow nervous at waiting. Patience was one of the few weapons left to her at present. "It seems the Amelin has been mulling over what to do about you for some time," Silviana said finally. If she had expected Egwene to begin shifting her feet or wringing her hands, she gave no sign of disappointment. She has a very complete plan ready. She doesn't want the tower to lose you, nor do I. Elida has decided that you have been used as a dupe by others and should not be held accountable, so you will not be charged with claiming to be Amelin. She has stricken your name from the roll of the accepted and entered it in the novice book again. I agree with that decision, frankly, though it's never been done before. Whatever your ability with the power, you missed almost everything else you should have learned as a novice. You needn't fear that you'll have to take the test again, though. I wouldn't force anyone to go through that twice. I am Aes Sedai by virtue of having been raised to the Amelin seat, Egwene replied calmly. There was no incongruity in fighting for a title when claiming it might still lead to her death. Acquiescence would be as sharp a blow to the rebellion as her execution, maybe sharper. A novice again? That was laughable. I can cite the relevant passages in the law if you wish. Sylviana arched an eyebrow and sat down to open a large leather-bound book, the punishments book. Dipping her pen in the simple glass ink jar, she made a notation. You've just earned your first visit to me. I'll give you the night to think about it rather than putting you over my knee now. Let's hope contemplation increases the salubrious effect. Do you think you can make me deny who I am with a spanking? Egwene was hard put to keep incredulity from her voice. She was not sure she succeeded. There are spankings and spankings, the other woman replied. Wiping the nib clean on a scrap, she replaced the pen in its glass holder and considered Egwene. You're accustomed to Shiriam Bayanar as mistress of novices. Sylviana shook her head disparagingly. I've browsed her punishments book. She let the girls get away with too much and was far too lenient with her favorites. As a result, she was forced to deal out correction much more often than she should have had to. I record a third of the punishments in a month that Shiriam did because I make sure that everyone I punish leaves here wishing above all things never to be sent to me again. Whatever you do, you'll never make me deny who I am, Egwene said firmly. How can you possibly think you can make this work? Am I to be escorted to classes, shielded all the while? Sylviana leaned back against her shawl, resting her hands on the edge of the table. You mean to resist as long as you can, do you? I will do what I must, and I will do what I must. During the day, you will not be shielded at all, but every hour you will be given a mild tincture of forkweed. Sylviana's mouth twisted on the word. She picked up the sheet that contained Elida's notes as if to read, then let it drop back onto the tabletop, rubbing her fingertips as though something noxious clung to them. I cannot like this stuff. It seems aimed directly at Aes Sedai. Someone who cannot channel can drink 5 times the amount that makes a sister pass out and barely grow dizzy from it. A disgusting brew. Yet useful, it seems. Perhaps it can be used on those Ashima. The tincture won't make you dizzy, but you won't be able to channel enough to cause any problems. Only trickles. Refuse to drink, and it will be poured down your throat anyway. You'll be closely watched as well, so you don't try to slip away afoot. At night you will be shielded, since giving you enough forkroot to make you sleep through the night would leave you doubled up with stomach cramps the next day. You are a novice, Egwene, and you will be a novice. Many sisters still consider you a runaway, no matter what orders Swan Sanche gave, and others doubtless will think Elida wrong not to have you beheaded. They'll watch for every infraction, every fault. You may sneer at a spanking now before you've received it, but when you're being sent to me for 5, 6, 7 every day, we'll see how long it takes you to change your mind. Egwene surprised herself by giving a small laugh, and Sylviana's eyebrows shot up. Her hand twitched as though to reach for her pen. Did I say something funny, child? Not at all, Egwene replied truthfully. It had occurred to her that she could deal with the pain by embracing it in the Aiel manner. She hoped it worked, but there went all hope for dignity, while she was being punished at least. For the rest, she could only do what she could. Sylviana glanced at the book, touching it. Then I am done with you for tonight. I will see you before breakfast, however. Come with me." She started for the door, confident that Egwene would follow, and Egwene did. Attacking the other woman physically would achieve no more than another entry in the book. Well, she would find a way around that somehow. If not, she refused to think about that. Katerina and Barasine were startled, to say the least, at hearing Elida's plans for Egwene, and not best pleased to learn that they would be watching her and shielding her while she slept. Although Sylviana told them she would arrange for other sisters to come after an hour or two. Why both of us? Katerina wanted to know, which earned her a wry glance from Barasine. If only one were sent, it surely would not be Katerina, who stood higher. Firstly, because I said so. Sylviana waited until the other two Reds nodded in acceptance. They did so with obvious reluctance, but not enough to make her wait long. She had not put on her shawl to come into the hallway, and in some odd fashion she seemed the one out of place. And secondly, because this child is tricky, I think. I want her watched carefully, awake or asleep. Which of you has her ring? After a moment, Barasine produced the circle of gold from her belt pouch, muttering, "I only thought to keep it as a memento of the rebels being brought to heel. They're finished now, for sure." A memento? It was stealing, was what it was. Egwene reached for the ring, but Sylviana's hand got there first, and it was into her pouch that the ring went. "I'll keep this until you have the right to wear it again, child. Now take her to the novices' quarters and settle her in. A room should have been prepared by now." Katerina resumed the shield and bowed to Egwene's arm again, but Egwene stretched out a hand towards Sylviana. "Wait, there's something I must tell you." She had agonized over this. It would be all too easy to reveal far more than she wanted, but she had to do it. "I have the talent of dreaming. I've learned to tell the true dreams, and to interpret some of them. I dreamt of a glass lamp that burned with a white flame. Two ravens flew out of mist, struck the lamp, and flew on. The lamp wobbled, flinging off droplets of flaming oil. Some of those burned up in midair, others landed scattered about, and the lamp still wobbled on the edge of falling. It means the Shanshan will attack the White Tower and do great harm." Barasine sniffed. Katerina gave a derisive snort. "A dreamer," Sylviana said flatly. "Is there anyone who can back up your claim? And if there is, how can you be sure your dream means the Shanshan? Ravens would indicate the shadow to me." "I'm a dreamer, and when a dreamer knows, she knows. Not the shadow, the Shanshan. As for who knows what I can do," Egwene shrugged. "The only one you can reach is Lyanna Sheriff, who's being held in the cells below." She saw no way to bring the wise ones into this, not without revealing entirely too much. "That woman is a wilder, not—" Katerina began angrily, but her mouth snapped shut when Sylviana raised a peremptory hand. The mistress of novices studied Egwene carefully, her face still an unreadable mask of calmness. "You truly believe you are what you say," she said finally. "I do hope your dreaming won't cause as many problems as young Nicola's foretelling, if you truly can dream. Well, I will pass along your warning. I can't see how the Shanshan could strike at us here in Tarvalin, but watchfulness never hurts. And I'll question this woman being held below, carefully. And if she fails to back up your tale, then your visit to me in the morning will be even more memorable for you." She waved her hand at Katerina. "Take her away before she hands me another nugget and keeps me from getting any sleep at all tonight." This time Katerina muttered as much as Barasine, but they both waited until they were beyond earshot of Sylviana. That woman was going to be a formidable opponent. Egwene hoped embracing pain worked as well as the wise ones claimed. Otherwise did not bear thinking about. A lean, gray-haired serving woman gave them directions to the room she had just finished making up, on the third gallery of the novices' quarters, and hurried on after brief curtsies to the two Reds. She never so much as glanced at Egwene. What was another novice to her? It tightened Egwene's jaw. She was going to have to make people not see her as just another novice. Look at her face, Varusine said. I think it's finally settling in on her. I am who I am, Egwene replied calmly. Varusine pushed her toward the stairs that rose through the hollow column of railed galleries lit by the fat, waning moon. A breeze sighed through, the only sound. It all seemed so peaceful. There was no light showing around any door. The novices would be asleep by now, except for those who had late chores or tasks. It was peaceful for them. Not for Egwene, though. The tiny windowless room might almost have been the one she had occupied when she first came to the tower, with its narrow bed built against the wall and a small fire burning on the little brick hearth. The lamp on the small table was lit, but it lighted little more than the tabletop, and the oil must have gone bad because it gave off a faint, unpleasant stink. A washstand completed the furnishings except for a three-legged stool, onto which Katerina promptly lowered herself, adjusting her skirts as though on a throne. Realizing there was nowhere for her to sit, Varusine crossed her arms beneath her breasts and frowned at Egwene. The room was quite crowded with 3 women in it, but Egwene pretended the other 2 did not exist, as she readied herself for bed, hanging her cloak and belt and dress on 3 of the pegs set along one rough-plastered white wall. She did not ask for help with her buttons. By the time she laid her neatly rolled stockings atop her shoes, Varusine had settled herself cross-legged on the floor and was immersed in the small leather-bound book that she must have carried in her belt pouch. Katerina kept her eyes on Egwene as though she expected her to make a break for the door. Crawling beneath the light woolen blanket in her shift, Egwene settled her head on the small pillow, not a goose-down pillow, that was for sure, and went through the exercises, relaxing her body one part at a time that would put her to sleep. She had done that so often that it seemed no sooner had she begun than she was asleep and floating, formless, in a darkness that lay between the waking world and Tel'aran'rhiod, the narrow gap between dream and reality, a vast void filled with a myriad of twinkling specks of light that were all the dreams of all the sleepers in the world. They floated around her in this place with no up or down, as far as the eye could see, flickering out as a dream ended, springing a light as one began. She could recognize some at sight, put a name to the dreamer, but she did not see the one she sought. It was to Swan she needed to speak. Swan, who likely knew by now that disaster had struck, who might be unable to sleep until exhaustion took her under. She settled herself to wait. There was no sense of time here. She would not grow bored with waiting, but she had to work out what to say. So much had changed since she wakened. She had learned so much. Then she had been sure she would die soon, sure the sisters inside the tower were a solid army behind Elida. Now, Elida thought her safely imprisoned. No matter this talk of making her a novice again, even if Elida really believed it, Egwene Alvear did not. She did not consider herself a prisoner either. She was carrying the battle into the heart of the tower itself. If she had had lips there, she would have smiled. Chapter 1. When Last Sounds. The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. In one age, called the Third Age, by some an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose above the broken mountain named Dragon Mount. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time, but it was a beginning. Born beneath the glow of a fat, sinking moon, at an altitude where men could not breathe, born among writhing currents, heated by the fires inside the ragged peak, the wind was a zephyr in the beginning, yet it gained in strength as it rushed down the steep, rugged slope. Carrying ash and the stench of burning sulfur from the heights, the wind roared across the sudden snowy hills that reared from the plains surrounding the impossible height of Dragon Mount, roared and tossed trees in the night. Eastward out of the hills the wind howled, across a large pasture encampment, a considerable village of tents and wooden walkways lining streets of frozen ruts. Soon enough the ruts would melt, and the last of the snow vanish, replaced by spring rains and mud, if the encampment remained that long. Despite the hour, many among the Aes Sedai were awake, gathered in small groups, warded against eavesdropping, discussing what had transpired this night. No few of those discussions were quite animated, little short of argument, and some held undeniable heat. Fists might have been shaken or worse, had they not belonged to Aes Sedai. What to do next was the question. Every sister knew the news from the riverbank by now, if the details remained sketchy. The Amelin herself had gone in secret to seal South Harbor, and her boat had been found overturned and caught in the reeds. Survival in the swift icy currents of the Arian was unlikely, and hour by hour it had become more so until certainty hardened. The Amelin seat was dead. Every sister in the camp knew that her future and perhaps her life hung by a thread, not to mention the future of the White Tower itself. What to do now? Yet voices fell silent, and heads came up as the fierce blasts struck the camp, fluttering tent canvas like flags, pelting it with clods of snow. The sudden stink of burning sulfur hung heavy in the air, announcing where that wind had come from, and more than one Aes Sedai offered a silent prayer against evil. In moments, though, the wind had passed, and the sisters bent back to their deliberations on a future bleak enough to fit the sharp, fading stench left behind. On the wind roared toward Tarvalon, gaining strength as it went, shrieking over military camps near the river where soldiers and camp followers sleeping on the ground suddenly had their blankets stripped off, and those in tents awoke to canvas jerking and sometimes whipping away into the darkness as tent pegs gave way or guy ropes snapped. Laden wagons rocked and toppled, and banners stood out stiff before they were uprooted, their hurtling staffs now spears that pierced whatever lay in their path. Leaning against the gale, men struggled to the horse lines to calm animals that reared and screamed in fear. None knew what the Aes Sedai knew, yet the biting, sulphurous smell that filled the chill night air seemed an ill omen, and hardened men offered their prayers aloud as fervently as the beardless boys. Camp followers added their own, and loudly, armorers and farriers and fletchers, wives and laundresses and seamstresses, all clutched by the sudden fear that something darker than blackness stalked the night. The fierce flutter of canvas overhead, near to ripping, the babble of voices and the screams of horses, loud enough to cut through the wailing wind, helped Swan Sanche struggle awake for the second time. The abrupt stink of burning sulphur made her eyes water, and she was grateful for it. Egwene might be able to don and doff sleep like a pair of stockings, but the same was not true for her. Sleep had been hard enough to come by after she finally made herself lie down. Once the news had reached her from the riverbank, she had been sure she never would sleep because of utter exhaustion. She had offered prayers for Lyanna, but all of their hopes rested on Egwene's shoulders, and all of their hopes seemed gutted and hung up to dry. Well, she had exhausted herself with nerves and worry and pacing. Now there was hope again, and she did not dare let her leaden eyelids close for fear she would sink back into slumber and not wake till midday, if then. The ferocious wind abated, but people's shouts and horses' cries did not. Wearily, she tossed aside her blankets and stood up unsteadily. Her bedding was hardly comfortable, laid out on a canvas ground cloth in a corner of the not very large square tent. Yet she had come here, though it meant riding. Of course she had been near falling down by then, and likely not in her right mind from grief. She touched the twisted ring Turangril hanging from a leather cord around her neck. Her first waking, every bit as hard as this one, had been to fetch that from her belt pouch. Well, the grief was vanquished now, and that was adequate to keep her moving. A sudden yawn made her jaws creak like rusty oarlocks. Barely adequate. You would have thought Egwene's message, the fact that Egwene was alive to send the message, would be enough to banish bone weariness. Not so, it appeared. Channeling a globe of light long enough to see the box lantern on the main tent pole, she lit it with a thread of fire. The single flame gave a very pale, flickering illumination. There were other lamps and lanterns, but Gareth went on so about how little lamp oil there was in stock. The brazier she left unlit. Gareth was not so parsimonious with charcoal as oil. Charcoal was easier come by, but she was barely aware of the frigid air. She frowned at his bedding, still lying untouched on the other side of the tent. He surely was aware of the boat's discovery and who it had carried. The sisters did their best to keep secrets from him, but somehow they succeeded less often than most believed. More than once he had startled her with what he knew. Was he out there in the night organizing his soldiers for whatever the hall decided? Or had he already departed, leaving a lost cause? No longer lost, yet he must be unaware of that. No, she muttered, feeling an odd sense of treachery, that she had cast doubt on the man, even in her own mind. He would still be there at sunrise, and for every sunrise until the hall commanded him to leave, maybe longer. She did not believe he would abandon Egwene, whatever the hall commanded. He was too stubborn proud. No, it was not that. Gareth Bryn's word was his honor. Once given, he would not take it back unless released, whatever the cost to himself. And maybe, just maybe, he had other reasons to stay. She refused to think of that. Putting Gareth out of her mind, why had she come to his tent? It would have been so much easier to lie down in her own and the sisters' camp, cramped as it was, or even to have kept the weeping chaser company, though on second thought that last might have been beyond her. She could not abide weeping, and Egwene's maid would not stop. Putting Gareth firmly out of her head, she ran a hasty brush through her hair, changed her shift for a fresh one, and dressed as quickly as she could in the dim light. Her plain blue wool riding dress was rumpled and spotted with mud on the hem besides. She had gone down to see the boat for herself, but she did not take the time to clean and press it with the power. She had to hurry. The tent was far from the spacious affair you would have expected of a general, so hurrying meant bumping her hip against the corner of the writing table hard enough that one of the legs almost folded before she could catch it, nearly tripping over the camp stool, the only thing approaching a chair, and barking her shins on the brass-bound chests that lay scattered about. That brought a curse that would have singed any listener's ears. The things served double duty, soups as well as storage, and one with a flat top did their makeshift washstand with a pitcher and bowl. In truth, they were arrayed in a neat enough fashion, but one peculiar to him. He could find his way through that maze in pitch dark. Anyone else would break a leg to reach his bedding. She supposed he must have a concern for assassins, though he had never voiced it. Gathering her dark cloak from atop one of the chests and folding it over her arm, she paused on the point of snuffing the lantern with a flow of air. For a moment she stared at Gareth's second pair of boots, standing at the foot of his bedding. Channeling another small sphere of light, she moved it close to the boots. As she had thought, freshly black. The bloody man insisted she work off her debt, then sneaked in behind her back, or worse, under her nose while she slept, and blacked his own bloody boots. Gareth Bloody Bryn treated her like a maidservant, never so much as tried to kiss her. She jerked upright, her mouth going taut as a mooring rope. Now where had that thought come from? No matter what Egwene claimed, she was not in love with Gareth Bloody Bryn. She was not. She had too much work in front of her to get caught in that kind of foolishness. That's why you stopped wearing embroidery, I suppose, a small voice whispered in the back of her head. All those pretty things stuffed into chests because you're afraid. Afraid? Burn her if she was afraid of him or any man. Carefully channeling earth, fire, and air just so, she laid the weave on the boots. Every last bit of the blacking, and most of the dye as well, came away and formed into a neat, glistening sphere that floated in the air, leaving the leather decidedly gray. For a moment she contemplated depositing the ball among his blankets. That would be a suitable surprise for him when he finally lay down. With a sigh, she pushed open the door flap and took the ball outside into the darkness to let it splash onto the ground. The man had a short and extremely disrespectful way when she let her temper carry her too far, as she had discovered the first time she hit him over the head with the boots she was cleaning, and when he made her so angry she put salt in his tea. Quite a lot of salt. But it had not been her fault. He was hurried enough to drain the cup in a gulp. To try to, at any rate. Oh, he never seemed to mind when she shouted, and sometimes he shouted back. Sometimes he just smiled, which was purely infuriating. Yet he had his limits. She could have stopped him with a simple wave of air, of course, but she had her honor as much as he had his. Burn him. Anyway, she had to stay close to him. Men said so, and the girl seemed infallible. That was the only reason she had not stuffed a fistful of gold down Gareth Bryn's throat and told him he was paid and be burned. The only reason, besides her own honor, of course. Yawning, she left the dark puddle shining in the cold moonlight. If he stepped in it before it dried and tracked the mess inside, the blame would be his own and none of hers. At least the sulphur smell had faded a little. Her eyes had stopped overflowing, though what she could see was turmoil. This sprawling, night-shrouded camp had never had much order. The rutted streets were straight enough, true, and wide for moving soldiers, but for the rest it had always seemed a haphazard array of tents and rough shelters and stone-lined pits for cook fires. Now it looked much as if it had been under attack. Collapsed tents lay everywhere, some tossed atop others that still stood, though a good many of those stood askew, and dozens of wagons and carts lay on their sides or upside down. Voices on every side called for help with the injured, of whom there appeared to be a fair number. Men limped along the street in front of Gareth's tent, supported by other men, while several small groups hurried by, carrying blankets being used as stretchers. Farther away, she could see 4 blanket-covered shapes on the ground, 3 attended by kneeling women who rocked back and forth as they keened. She could do nothing for the dead, but she could offer her ability with healing to the others. That was hardly her greatest skill, not very strong at all, though it seemed to have returned to her fully when Nynaeve healed her. Yet she doubted there was another sister anywhere in the camp. They did avoid the soldiers, most of them. Her ability would be better than none. She could, except for the news she carried. It was urgent that it reach the right people as soon as possible. So she closed her ears to the groans and the keens alike, ignored dangling arms and rags clutched to bleeding heads, and hurried to the horse lines on the edge of the camp, where the oddly sweet smell of horse dung was beginning to win over the sulphur. A raw-boned, unshaven fellow with a haggard glare on his dark face tried to rush past her, but she caught his rough coat sleeve. "Saddle me the mildest horse you can find," she told him, "and do it right now." Bella would have done nicely, but she had no notion where among all those animals the stout mare was tied, and no intention of waiting for her to be found. "You want to go riding?" he said incredulously, jerking his sleeve free. "If you own a horse, then saddle it yourself, if you're fool enough to. Me, I've the rest of the night ahead of me in the cold, tending the ones what's hurt themselves, and lucky if at least one don't die." Swan ground her teeth. The imbecile took her for one of the seamstresses, or one of the wives. For some reason that seemed worse. She stuck her right fist in front of his face so quickly that he stepped back with a curse, but she shoved her hand close enough to his nose that her great serpent ring had to be the only thing he could see. His eyes crossed, staring at it. "The mildest mount you can find," she said in a flat voice, but quickly. The ring did the trick. He swallowed, then scratched his head and stared along the horse lines, where every animal seemed to be either stamping or shivering. "Mild," he muttered. "I'll see what I can do, Aes Sedai. Mild." Touching a knuckle to his forehead, he hurried off down the rows of horses, still muttering to himself. Swan did a little muttering herself as she paced, 3 strides this way and 3 that. Snow trampled the slush and frozen again crunched under her stout shoes. From what she could see, it might take him hours to find anything that would not pitch her off if it heard a grunter jump. Swinging her cloak around her shoulders, she shoved the small silver circle pin in place with an impatient jab, nearly stabbing her own thumb. Afraid, was she? She would show Gareth bloody Bryn. Back and forth, back and forth. Perhaps she should walk the whole long way. It would be unpleasant, but better than being dumped from the saddle and maybe breaking bones in the bargain. She never mounted a horse, including Bella, without thinking of broken bones. But the fellow returned with a dark mare bearing a high-cantled saddle. "She's mild?" Swan demanded skeptically. The animal was stepping as though ready to dance, and looked sleek. That was supposed to indicate speed. Night Lily here's meek as milk water, Aes Sedai. Belongs to my wife, and the Maris is on the delicate side. She don't like a mount what gets frisky. If you say so, she replied, and sniffed. Horses were seldom meek in her experience, but there was nothing for it. Taking the reins, she clambered awkwardly into the saddle, then had to shift so she was not sitting on her cloak and half strangling herself every time she moved. The mare did dance, however she sawed the reins. She'd been sure it would, trying to break her bones already. A boat now, with one oar or two, a boat went where you wanted and stopped when you wanted, unless you were a complete fool about tides and currents and winds. But horses possessed brains, however small, and that meant they might take it into their minds to ignore bridle and reins and what the rider wanted. That had to be considered when you had to stop a bloody horse. One thing I should the man said as he was trying to find a comfortable seat. Saddles always seem harder than this. I'd keep it to a walk tonight, was ideal. That wind, might stink. Well, she might be just a touch. No time, Swan said, and dug her heels in. Mika's milk-water night lily leaped ahead so fast that she nearly pitched backward over the cantle. Only a quick grab at the pommel kept her in the saddle. She thought the fellow shouted something after her, but she could not be certain. What in the life did this man consider a frisky horse? The mare sped out of the camp as though trying to win a race, sped toward the falling moon and Dragon Mount, a dark spike rising against the starry sky. Smoke billowing behind, Swan made no effort to slow her, raising her heels again and slapping the mare's neck with the reins as she had seen others do to urge speed. She had to reach the sisters before anybody did something irretrievable. All too many possibilities came to mind. The mare galloped past small thickets and tiny hamlets and sprawling farms with their stone-walled pastures and fields. Snow-covered slate roofs, walls of stone or brick. The inhabitants had not been roused by that fierce wind. Every building lay dark and still. Even the bloody cows and sheep were probably enjoying the Farmers always had cows and sheep. And pigs. Bouncing around on the hard leather of the saddle, she tried leaning forward over the mare's neck. That was how it was done. She had seen it. Almost immediately, she lost her left stirrup and nearly slid off on that side, barely clawing her way back to get her foot back in place. The only thing to do was sit bolt upright, one hand clutching the pommel in a death grip, the other tighter still on the reins. Her flailing cloak tugged uncomfortably against her throat, and she jounced up and down so hard that her teeth clicked if she opened her mouth at the wrong time. But she hung on, and even healed the animal once more. Light, but she was going to be bruised within an inch of her life come sunrise. On through the night, smacking the saddle with the mare's every bounding stride. At least her clenched teeth kept her from yawning. Horse lines and rows of wagons that ranged the Aes Sedai camp appeared out of the darkness through a thin rim of trees, and with a sigh of relief she hauled back on the reins as hard as she could. For a horse moving this fast, surely it required hard hauling to stop. Night Lily did stop, so abruptly that she would have hurtled over its head if the mare had not reared at the same time. Wide-eyed, she clung to the animal's neck until it finally settled all four hooves to the ground again, and for some little time after as well. Night Lily was breathing hard, too, she realized. Panting, really. She felt no sympathy. The fool animal had tried to kill her just the way horses would. Recovering herself took a moment, but then she pulled her cloak straight, gathered the reins, and rode past the wagons and the long lines of horses as it shadowy men moved in the darkness along the horse lines, doubtless grooms and farriers, seeing to the visibly unsettled animals. The mare seemed more biddable now. Really, this was not too bad at all. As she entered the camp proper, she hesitated only a moment before embracing Sidon. Strange to think of a camp full of Aes Sedai as dangerous, yet two sisters had been murdered here. Considering the circumstances of their deaths, it seemed unlikely that holding the power would be enough to save her if she was the next target, but Sidar at least gave an illusion of safety. So long as she remembered it was only illusion. After a moment she wove the flows of spirit that would hide her ability and the glow of the power. There was no need to advertise, after all. Even at this hour, with the moon low in the west, there were a few people out on the wooden walkways, serving women and workmen, scurrying about late tasks. Or perhaps early would be a better word now. Most of the tents, in nearly every size and shape imaginable, were dark, but a number of the larger ones glowed with the light of lamps or candles, unsurprising under the circumstances. Every lit tent had men around it or gathered in front, warders. No one else could stand so still they seemed to fade into the night, especially not in this icy night. With the power filling her, she could make out others, their warders' cloaks making them vanish in the shadows. Between the murdered sisters and what their bonds to their Aes Sedai must be carrying to them, not surprising at all. She suspected more than one sister was ready to tear her own hair, or someone else's. They took note of her, heads swiveling to follow her passage as she rode slowly along the frozen ruts, searching. The hall had to be informed, of course, but others needed to hear first. In her estimation, they were much more likely to do something precipitate and quite possibly disastrous. Oaths held them, but oaths given under duress to a woman they now believed dead. For the hall, for most of the hall, they had nailed their flag to the mast in accepting a seat. None of them would be jumping until they were very, very sure where they would land. Shiriam's tent was too small for what she was sure she would find, and dark besides, she noted in passing. She very much doubted the woman was asleep inside, though. Morvrin's, big enough to sleep four comfortably, would have done if there was room among all the books the Brown had managed to acquire on the march, but that was dark as well. Her third choice provided a catch, though, and she reined in Night Lily well short of it. Mirelle had two peaked tents in the camp, one for herself and one for her three warders, the three she dared acknowledge, and her own shone brightly, the shadows of women moving on the patched canvas walls. Three dissimilar men stood on the walkway in front of the tent. Their stillness marked them warders, but she ignored them for the moment. What exactly were they talking about inside? Certain that it was useless effort, she wove air with just a hint of fire. The weave touched the tent and struck a barrier against eavesdropping. Inverted, of course, and so invisible to her. She had only made the attempt on the chance they were being careless. Small possibility of that, with the secrets they had to hide. The shadows against the canvas were still now, so they knew someone had tried. She rode the rest of the way, wondering what they had been talking about. As she dismounted, well, at least she managed to turn half falling off into something akin to jumping down. One of the warders, Shiriam's Arinvar, a lean Kariene little taller than she, stepped forward to reach for the reins with a small bow, but she waved him away. Releasing Saidar, she tied the mare to one of the wooden slats of the walkway, using a knot that would have held a sizable boat against heavy winds and a strong current. None of those casual loops that others used, not for her. She might dislike riding, but when she tied a horse, she wanted it there when she came back. Arinvar's eyebrows climbed as he watched her finish the knot, but he would not be the one who had to pay for the bloody animal if it got loose and lost itself. Only one of the other two warders belonged to Mirelle, Avar Hachami, a Saldaean with a nose like an eagle's beak and thick gray-streaked mustaches. After sparing her one glance and a slight inclination of his head, he returned to watching the night. Morvrin's jury, short and bald and nearly as wide as he was tall, did not acknowledge her at all. His eyes studied the darkness, and his hand rested lightly on his long sword hilt. Supposedly he was among the best of the warders with a blade. Where were the others? She could not ask, of course, any more than she could ask who was within. The men would have been shocked to their bones. None of them tried to stop her from entering. At least matters had not gotten that bad. Inside, where two braziers gave off the scent of roses and made the air almost toasty compared to the night, she found almost everyone she had hoped for, and all watching to see who entered. Mirelle herself, sitting on a sturdy straight chair in a silk robe covered with red and yellow flowers, her arms folded beneath her breasts, wore such a perfect expression of calm on her olive face that it only pointed up the heat in her dark eyes. The light of the power shone around her. It was her tent, after all. She would be the one to leave a ward here. Shiriam, seated on one end of Mirel's cot with a straight back, pretended to be adjusting her blue-slashed skirts. Her expression was as fiery as her hair, and it grew hotter when she saw Swan. She was not wearing the keeper's stole, a bad sign. I might have expected it would be you, Carlinia said coldly, fists on her hips. She was never a warm woman, but now the ringlets that stopped well short of her shoulders framed a face that seemed carved from ice, nearly as pale as her dress. I will not have you trying to listen in on my private conversations, Swan. Oh, yes. They thought everything was at an end. Round-faced Morgrin, for once not appearing at all absent-minded or sleepy-eyed, despite the creases in her brown wool skirt, walked around the small table where a tall silver pitcher and 5 silver cups sat on a lacquered tray. It seemed no one felt like tea. The cups were all dry. Dipping into her belt pouch, the graying sister thrust a carven horn comb into Swan's hand. You are all wind-blown, woman. Fix your hair before someone else takes you for a tavern trou instead of an Aes Sedai and tries to dangle you on his knee. Egwene and Lyanna are alive and prisoners inside the tower, Swan announced, more calmly than she felt. A tavern trou? Touching her hair, she discovered that the other woman was right, and began working the comb through the tangles. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you could not look as though you had been tussling in an alley. She had enough difficulty with that as it was now, and would have until some years after she could lay hands on the oath rod again. Egwene spoke to me in my dreams. They succeeded in blocking the harbors near enough, but they were captured. Where are Bayanin and Misal? One of you go fetch them. I don't want to scale the same fish twice. There. If they thought themselves free of their oaths and free of Egwene's orders to obey her, that should disabuse them, except that no one moved to obey. Bayanin wanted her dead, Morgan said slowly, studying Swan, a very intense study. A sharp mind hid behind that placid face. She was too tired to talk any more. And why would we have asked Misal to join us? That earned a small frown from Mirel, who was Misal's friend, but the other two nodded agreement. They and Bayanin thought of Misal as apart from themselves, in spite of the oaths of fealty they shared. In Swan's opinion, these women had never stopped believing they might still guide events somehow, even after the rudder had long since been taken from their hands. Shiriam rose from the cot as though about to rush off, even gathering her skirts, but that had nothing to do with Swan's command. Anger had vanished, replaced by shining eagerness. We don't need them for the moment in any case. Prisoners means the deep cells until the hall convenes for a trial. We can travel there and free them before Elida knows what is happening. Mirel gave a sharp nod and stood, reaching to undo the sash of her robe. Best if we leave the warders behind, I think. They won't be needed in this. She drew more deeply on the source, already anticipating. No, Swan said sharply, and winced as the comb caught in her hair. Sometimes she thought of cutting it shorter than Carlinia's, for convenience, but Gareth had complimented her, saying how much he liked the way it brushed her shoulders. Light. Could she not escape the man even here? Egwene isn't to be tried, and she isn't in the deep cells. She wouldn't tell me where she is being held, except to say that she is guarded constantly, and she orders that there be no attempt to rescue her that involves sisters. The other women stared at her in shocked silence. In truth, she herself had argued the point with Egwene, to no avail. It had been an order, delivered by the Amelin seat in full fig. What you're saying is irrational, Carlinia said finally. Her tone was still cool, her face serene, but her hands smoothed her embroidered white skirts unnecessarily. If we capture Elida, we will try her and very likely still her. If. Their doubts and fears were not put to rest yet. Since she has Egwene, surely she will do the same. I don't need Bayanin to tell me what the law says in that regard. We must rescue her, whatever she wants. Shiriam's voice was hot as Carlinia's was chill, and her green eyes sparkled. Her hands had turned to fists gripping her skirts. She cannot realize the danger she is in. She must be in shock. Did she give you any hints where she's held? Don't try to hide things from us, Swan, Mirel said firmly. Her eyes seemed almost on fire, and she jerked the silk sash tighter for emphasis. Why would she hide where she's being held? For fear of what you and Shiriam suggest. Giving up on the wind-whipped tangles, Swan tossed the comb down on the table. She could not stand there combing her hair and expect them to pay attention. Household would have to do. She is guarded, Mirel, by sisters, and they won't give her up easily. If we try a rescue, Aes Sedai will die at the hands of Aes Sedai, sure as silver pike spawn in the reeds. It's happened once, but it must not happen again, for all hope dies of reuniting the tower peacefully. We cannot allow it to happen again. So there is to be no rescue. As to why Elida has decided not to try her, I can't say. Egwene had been vague on that, as if she did not understand either, but she had been definite on the facts, and it was not a claim she would make unless she was sure. Peacefully, Shiriam muttered, sinking back onto the cot. She imbued the word with a world of bitterness. Was there ever any chance of that from the beginning? Elida has abolished the Blue Aja. What chance of peace is there? Elida cannot simply do away with an Aja, Morgan murmured, as though that had anything to do with anything. She patted Shiriam's shoulder, but the fire-haired woman sullenly shrugged off her plump hand. There is always a chance, Cornelia said. The harbors are blocked, strengthening our position. The negotiators meet every morning. Trailing off with a troubled look in her eyes, she poured a cup of tea and drank half of it down in one go without adding honey. Blocking the harbors likely would have put an end to the negotiations by itself. Not that they had seemed to be going anywhere. Would Elida let them continue with Egwene in her hands besides? I do not comprehend why Elida would not have Egwene put on trial, Morgan said, since conviction would be sure and certain, but the fact remains that she is a prisoner. She displayed none of Shiriam or Mirel's heat, and none of Cornelia's coldness. She was simply presenting the facts, with only a slight tightness of her mouth. If she is not to be tried, then without any doubt she is to be broken. She has proven to be a stronger woman than I took her for at first, but no one is strong enough to resist the white power when it decides to break her. We must consider the consequences if we don't get her out before it can. Swan shook her head. She isn't even going to be birched, Morgan. I don't understand why either, but she'd hardly tell us to leave her if she thought they were going to torture. She broke off as the tent flap was pushed open, and Lelaine Akashi stepped in, blue-fringed shawl draped along her arms. Shiriam stood, though she need not have. Lelaine was a sitter, but Shiriam was the keeper. Then again, Lelaine was imposing in blue-slashed velvet, despite her slenderness, dignity made flesh, with an air of authority that seemed greater than ever tonight. Every hair in place, she might have been entering the hall after a sound night's sleep. Smoothly, Swan turned to the table and picked up the pitcher as if in anticipation. That normally would have been her role in this company, to pour tea and speak when her opinion was sought. Perhaps if she remained quiet, Lelaine would be about her business with the others and leave quickly without giving her a second glance. The woman seldom did give her that much. I thought that horse outside was the same I saw you ride in on, Swan. Lelaine's gaze ran over the other sisters, each of them absolutely smooth-faced now. Am I interrupting? Swan says Egwene is alive, Shiriam said, as though relating the price of Delta perch on the dockhead. And Liana. Egwene spoke to Swan's dreams. She refuses any attempt at a rescue. Mirel gave her a sidelong glance, unreadable, but Swan could have boxed her ears. Likely Lelaine would have been the next she sought out, but to tell her in her own way, not spilled out on the wharf like this. Of late, Shiriam had become as flighty as a novice. Pursing her lips, Lelaine directed a look like twin owls at Swan. Did she now? You really should be wearing your stole, Shiriam. You are the keeper. Will you walk with me, Swan? It's been far too long since we had a conversation alone. With one hand, she drew back the door flap. shifting that penetrating gaze to the other sisters. Shiriam blushed as only a redhead could, brilliantly, and fumbled the narrow blue stole from her belt pouch to lay it across her shoulders. But Mirel and Carlinia met Lillian's study with level eyes. Morvern had begun tapping her round chin with a fingertip as though unaware of anyone else. She might well have been. Morvern was like that. Had Egwene's orders sunk in? Swan had no chance even for a firm look while putting the pitcher down. A suggestion from a sister of Lillian's standing, sitter or not, was a command to one of Swan's standing. Gathering her cloak and skirts, she went out, murmuring thanks to Lillian for holding the flat for her. Like she hoped those fools had listened to what she said. 4 warders stood outside now, but one of them was Lillian's Barin, a copper-skinned stump of a Damali wrapped in a warder cloak that made most of him seem not there. And Avar had been replaced by another of Mirel's, Nuhel Dromond, a tall, burly man with an Ileana beard that left his upper lip bare. The man was so still you might have thought him a statue if not for the wisps of mist in front of his nostrils. Arenvar bowed to Lillian, a quick courtesy, though formal. Nuhel and Jory did not let their vigilance slacken, nor did Barin, for that matter. The knot that secured Night Lily took as long to undo as it had to tie, but Lillian waited patiently until Swan straightened with the reins in her hands, then set off at a slow pace along the wooden walkway past dark tents. Moon shadows masked her face. She did not embrace the power, so Swan could not either. Trailed by Barin, Swan walked beside Lillian, leading the mare, holding her silence. It was the sitter's place to begin, and not only because she was a sitter. Swan fought the urge to bend her neck and so lose the extra inch she had on the other woman. She seldom thought any longer of the time when she had been Amelin. She had been embraced as Aes Sedai once more, and part of being Aes Sedai meant fitting into your niche among the sisters instinctively. The bloody horse nuzzled at her hand as though it thought itself a pet, and she shifted the reins to her other hand long enough to wipe her fingers on her cloak. Filthy, slobbering beast. Lillian eyed her sideways, and she felt her cheeks heaving. Instinct. Strange friends you have, Swan. I believe some of them were in favor of sending you away when you first appeared in Salodar. Shiriam I might comprehend, though I think the fact that she stands so much higher than you now would make for awkwardness. That was the major reason I avoided you myself, to avoid awkwardness. Swan nearly gaped in astonishment. That came very near to talking about what was never to be talked about. Very near. A transgression she would never have expected from this woman. From herself, perhaps. She had fitted herself into her niche, yet she was who she was. But never from Lillian. I hope you and I can become friends again, Swan, though I can understand if that proves impossible. This meeting tonight confirms what Faelaine told me. Lillian gave a small laugh and folded her hands at her waist. Oh, don't grimace so, Swan. She didn't betray you, at least not intentionally. She made one slip too many, and I decided to press her, rather hard. Not the way to treat another sister, but then she's really just an accepted until she can be tested and passes. Faelaine will make a fine Aes Sedai. She was very reluctant to surrender everything she gave. Just bits and pieces, really, and a few names. But put together with you in that gathering, it gives me a complete picture, I think. I suppose I can let her free of confinement now. She certainly won't think of spying on me again. You and your friends have been very faithful to Egwene, Swan. Can you be as faithful to me? So that was why Faelaine had seemed to go into hiding. How many bits and pieces had she revealed while being pressed hard? Faelaine did not know everything, yet it would be best to assume that Lillian did. But assume while revealing nothing unless she herself was pressed hard. Swan stopped dead, drawing herself up. Lillian halted too, clearly waiting for her to speak. Even with her face half in shadow, that was clear. Swan had to steel herself to confront this woman. Some instincts were buried in the bone for Aes Sedai. I'm faithful to you as a sitter for my Aja, But Egwene Alvear is the Amerlin's seat. So she is. Lillian's expression remained unruffled, as much as Swan could make out. She spoke in your dreams? Tell me what you know of her situation, Swan. Swan glanced over her shoulder at the stocky warder. Don't mind him, the sitter said. I haven't kept a secret from Burin in 20 years. In my dreams, Swan agreed. She certainly did not intend to admit that had been only to summon her to Saladar and tell Riod. She was not supposed to have that ring in her possession. The Hall would take it away if they learned of it. Calmly, outwardly calmly at least, she related what she had told Mirel and the others, and more, but not everything. Not the certainty of betrayal. That had to have come from the Hall itself. No one else had known of the plan to block the harbor except the women involved, though whoever was accountable could not have known they were betraying Egwene, only helping Elida, which was mystery enough. Why would any among them want to help Elida? There had been talk of Elida's secret adherence from the start, yet she herself had long since dismissed the notion. Most assuredly, every Blue fervently wanted Elida pulled down, but until she knew who was responsible, no sitter, not even a Blue, would learn everything. She's calling a sitting of the Hall for tomorrow. No, it would be tonight, now, when last sounds, she finished. Inside the tower, in the hall of the tower. Lillian laughed so hard that she had to brush a tear from her eye. Oh, that is priceless. The hall to sit right under Elida's nose, as it were. I almost wish I could let her know, just to see her face. Just as abruptly, she turned serious again. Lillian had always had a ready laugh when she chose to let it out, but the core of her was always serious. So Egwene thinks the Ajahs may be turning on one another. That hardly seems possible. She's only seen a handful of sisters, you say. Still, it bears looking into the next time in Tel Riod. Perhaps someone can see what they can find in the Ajah quarters instead of concentrating on Elida's studies. Swan barely suppressed a wince. She planned to do a little searching in Tel Riod herself. Whenever she went to the tower in the world of dreams, she was a different woman in a different dress every time she turned a corner, but she would have to be even more cautious than usual. Refusing rescue is understandable, I suppose, even laudable. No one wants any more dead sisters. But very risky, Lillian went on. No trial and not even a birching. What can Elida be playing at? Can she think to make her take up as accepted again? That hardly seems likely. But she gave a small nod, as though considering it. This was heading in a dangerous direction. If sisters convinced themselves they knew where Egwene might be, the chance increased that someone would try to bring her out, Aes Sedai guards or no. Trying at the wrong place could be as risky as at the right one, if not more so. Worse, Lillian was ignoring something. Egwene has called the hall to sit, Swan asked acidly. Will you go? Reproving silence answered her, and her cheeks grew hot again. Some things were buried in the bone. Of course I will go, Lillian said at last. A direct statement, yet there had been a pause. The entire hall will go. Egwene Alvear is the Amerlin seat, and we have more than sufficient dream terangrial. Perhaps she will explain how she believes she can hold out if Elida orders her broken. I would very much like to hear that. Then what are you asking me to be faithful to you about? Instead of answering, Lillian resumed her slow walk through the moonlight, carefully adjusting her shawl. Burin followed her, a half-invisible line in the night. Swan hurried to catch up, tugging Night Lily after her, fending off the fool mare's attempts to nuzzle her hand again. Egwene Alvear is the lawful Amerlin seat, Lillian said finally, until she dies, or is still. Should either happen, we would be back to Ramonda trying for the staff and the stole, and me forestalling her. She snorted. That woman would be a disaster as bad as Elida. Unfortunately, she had enough support to forestall me as well. We'd be back to that, except that if Egwene dies or is still, you and your friends will be as faithful to me as you've been to Egwene, and you will help me gain the Amelin seat in spite of Ramonda." Swan felt as though her stomach had turned to ice. No blue would have been behind the first betrayal, but one blue, at least, had reason to betray Egwene now. Chapter 2. The Dark One's Touch. Bayanin woke at first light, as was her habit, though little of the dawn trickled into her tent past the closed door flap. Habits were good when they were the right habits. She had taught herself a number over the years. The air inside the tent held a touch of the night's chill, but she left the brazier unlit. She did not intend to remain long. Channeling briefly, she lit a brass lamp, then heated the water in the white glazed pitcher and washed her face at the rickety washstand with its bubbled mirror. Nearly everything in the small round tent was unsteady, from the tiny table to her narrow camp cot, and the only sturdy piece, a low-backed chair, was rude enough to have come from the poorest farm kitchen. She was accustomed to making do, though. Not all of the judgments she had been called on to make had been given in palaces. The meanest hamlet also deserved justice. She had slept in barns and even hovels to make it so. Moving deliberately, she put on the best riding dress she had with her, a plain gray silk that was very well cut, and snug boots that came to her knees, and began brushing her dark golden hair with an ivory-backed hairbrush that had belonged to her mother. Her reflection in the mirror was slightly distorted. For some reason, that irritated her this morning. Someone scratched at the tent flap, and a man called cheerily in a Mirandian accent, "Breakfast, Aes Sedai, if it pleases you." She lowered the brush and opened herself to the source. She had not acquired a personal serving woman, and it often seemed a new face brought every meal, yet she remembered the stout, graying man with the permanent smile who entered at her command, carrying a tray covered with a white cloth. "Leave it on the table, please, Evan," she said, releasing Saidar, and was rewarded with a widening of his smile, a deep bow over the tray, and another before the left. Too many sisters forgot the small courtesies to those beneath them. Small courtesies were the lubricant of daily life. Eyeing the tray without enthusiasm, she resumed her brushing, a twice-a-day ritual that she always found soothing. Rather than finding comfort in a brush sliding through her hair this morning, however, she had to make herself complete the full 100 strokes before laying the brush on the washstand beside the matching comb and hand mirror. Once she could have taught the hills patience, yet that had become harder and harder since Saladar, and nearly impossible since Nuremberg. So she schooled herself to it, as she had schooled herself to go to the White Tower against her mother's stern wishes, schooled herself to accept the tower's discipline along with its teaching. As a girl, she had been headstrong, always aspiring to more. The tower had taught her that you could achieve much if you could control yourself. She prided herself on that ability. Self-control or no self-control, lingering over her breakfast of stewed prunes and bread proved as difficult as completing her ritual with the hairbrush. The prunes had been dried, and perhaps too old to begin with. They had been stewed to mush, and she was sure she had missed a few of the black flecks that decorated the crusty bread. She tried to convince herself that anything that crunched between her teeth was a barley grain or a rye seed. This was not the first time she'd eaten bread containing weevils, yet it was hardly a thing to enjoy. The tea had a strange aftertaste, too, as though that also was beginning to spoil. When she finally replaced the linen cloth over the carved wooden tray, she very nearly sighed. How long before nothing edible remained in the camp? Was the same happening inside Tarvala? It must be so. The Dark One was touching the world, the thought as bleak as a field of jagged stones. But victory would come. She refused to entertain any other possibility. Young Althor had a great deal to answer for, a very great deal, yet he must achieve that somehow. Somehow. But the dragon reborn lay beyond her purview. All she could do was watch events unfold from afar. She had never liked sitting to one side and watching. All this bitter musing was useless. It was time to be moving. She stood up so quickly that her chair toppled over backward, but she left it lying there on the canvas ground cloth. Putting her head out at the door flap, she found Tervale on a stool on the walkway, his dark cloak thrown back, leaning on the scabbarded sword propped between his boots. The sun stood on the horizon, two-thirds of a bright golden ball, yet dark clouds in the other direction, massing around Dragonmount, suggested more snow before long, or perhaps rain. The sun felt close to warm after the previous night. Either way, with luck, she could be snug indoors soon. Tervale gave a small nod to acknowledge her, without stopping what appeared to be an idle study of everyone who moved in his sight. There were none but laborers at the moment, men in rough woolens carrying baskets on their backs, men and women just as roughly clad, driving high-wheeled carts, laden with bound firewood and sacks of charcoal and water barrels that clattered along the rutted street. At least his scrutiny would have seemed idle to someone lacking the warder bond with him. Her travail, he was focused as a drawn arrow. It was only the men he studied, and his gaze lingered on those he did not know personally. With two sisters and a warder dead at the hands of a man who could channel, it seemed beyond possibility there could be two murderers of that sort. Everyone was leery of strange men. Everyone who knew, at least. The news had hardly been shouted abroad. How he thought he might recognize the killer was beyond her unless the man carried a banner, but she would not upbraid or belittle him for trying to perform his duty. Whipcord lean, with a strong nose and a thick scar along his jaw earned in her service, he had been little more than a boy when she found him, cat prick, and already one of the finest swordsmen in her native Tarabon. And for all the years since, there had never been a moment when he did less. At least 20 times he had saved her life. Quite aside from brigands and footpads too ignorant to recognize an Aes Sedai, the law could be dangerous when one side or the other became.
Alright, everyone, I'm going to call Into This Life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.